Chapter 14 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G. A. Henty. Chapter 14. A Prince of Egypt. When Amuba recovered his senses he was lying in a heap at the bottom of the chariot. Two men were standing in the car beside him. The one he supposed to be the driver, the other the owner of the chariot. In a few minutes the chariot turned off through a stately gateway. The driver leaped down and closed the gates, and then led the horses to the steps leading up to a splendid mansion. The man beside him called out, and 2 or 3 slaves ran down the steps. Then he was lifted out, carried into the house, and laid upon a couch. A cup of wine was placed to his lips, and after he had drunk a slave bathed his head with cold water, and bandaged up the numerous cuts from which blood was flowing. This greatly refreshed him, and he raised himself on his arm. An order was given, and the slaves left the apartment, and Amuba looking up saw a tall and stately figure standing before him. He recognized him at once, for he had seen him following the king in one of the processions among the princes of Egypt. "Who are you? And is it true what those men whom I found maltreating you averred, that you are the slayer of the Cat of Bubastes?" "My name is Amuba, my lord," the lad said, striving to stand upright; but his questioner signed to him to remain seated. "I am a Rebu taken prisoner of war, and handed as a slave to Ameres, high priest of Osiris. I am not the slayer of the cat, but it is true that I was present at its death, and that it might just as well have been my arrow that accidentally pierced it as that of him who did so." "Then it was an accident?" the noble said. "It was wholly an accident, my lord. We fired at a hawk that had been thinning the pet birds of my master's daughter. One of the arrows struck a tree, and glancing off entered the house in which the cat was kept, and unfortunately caused its death. We regretted the accident bitterly, knowing how sacred was the animal in the sight of the Egyptians." "And not in your sight, young man? You are not yet a follower of the gods of the Egyptians?" "I am not, my lord," Amuba answered; "but at the same time I would not upon any account have willfully done aught to offend the religious opinions of others, although I myself have not been taught to consider the life of a cat as of more value than that of other animals." "Then you worship the gods of your own people?" Amuba was silent for a moment. "I would answer frankly, my lord, and I hope that you will not be displeased. Since I have come to Egypt I have come to think that neither the gods of the Egyptians nor the gods my fathers worshipped are the true gods. I believe that there is one great God over all, and that the others are but as it were his attributes, which men worship under the name of gods." The Egyptian uttered an exclamation of surprise. "Whence did you obtain such a belief as this?" he asked. Amuba was silent. "It must have been from Ameres himself," the noble went on, seeing that the lad was reluctant to answer. "I knew him well, and also that he carried to an extreme the knowledge he had gained. But how came it that he should speak of such matters to you, a slave?" "My master was good enough to make me a companion and friend to his son rather than a servant to him," Amuba replied, "partly because he thought that I should lead him to a more active life, which he needed, for he was overstudious; partly because I had high rank in my own country, of which my father was the king. But he never spoke of this matter until after the accident of the cat. My friend Chebron was utterly cast down at the sin he thought he had committed, and would at once have denounced himself, preferring death to living with such a burden upon his mind. Then his father, seeing that his whole life would be embittered, and that he would probably be forced to fly from Egypt and dwell in some other land, told him the belief which he himself held. I believed this all the more readily because I had heard much the same from an Israelite maiden who served my master's daughter." Again Amuba's listener uttered an exclamation of surprise. "I knew not," he said after a pause, "that there was an Israelite who still adhered to the religion of their ancestors." "The maiden told me that for the most part they had taken to the worship of the Egyptians, and indeed, so far as she knew, she was the last who clung to the old belief. She had been brought up by a great grandfather who had been driven from his people and forced to dwell apart, because he reproached them for having forsaken their God, and he instructed her in the faith he held, which was that there was but one God over all the earth." "Do you know who I am?" the noble asked abruptly. "I know that you are one of the princes of the land, my lord, for I have seen you in a procession following closely behind the king with his sons and other princes." I am also an Israelite. It seems strange to you, doubtless," he went on, as Amuba stared in astonishment at hearing a prince of Egypt declare himself as belonging to the hated race. "Many years ago, at the time I was an infant, there was a great persecution of the Israelites, and as is supposed my father and mother, fearing for my life, placed me in a little cradle and set me afloat on the water. It chanced, or was it chance or the will of God, that the water took me to the spot where the Princess Thermutis, the daughter of the then king, was bathing with her maidens. She had compassion upon me and adopted me, and as I grew up I had all the rights and privileges of her son, and rank, as you say, with the princes of Egypt. She called me Moses, for that was the name, as it seems, that was writ upon a piece of papyrus fastened to my cradle. I was instructed in all the learning of the Egyptians, and grew up as one of them. So I lived for many years, and had almost forgotten that I was not one of them. But now—" And here he stopped, and began thoughtfully to pace up and down the apartment. "What has become of the maiden of whom you spoke?" he asked, suddenly stopping before Amuba. "That I know not, my lord. Upon the day that Ameres was murdered by the mob his little daughter was carried off, and Ruth, for that is her name, has also been missing ever since. It is for that reason we have lingered here, otherwise we should have fled at once." "You and the son of Ameres?" "Yes, my lord, and another Rebu, one of my father's warriors, who was a fellow captive with me and also slave of Ameres. The high priest had great confidence in him, and committed to him the mission of aiding Chebron to escape, and of conducting us if possible back to my own land. But when we found that my young mistress was missing, we decided to remain to search for her." "What will you do when you find her?" "If we can rescue her from those who have carried her away, we shall hand her over to her mother, and then leave the land as we had intended. Unless, indeed, you, my lord, in your goodness, could obtain for Chebron a pardon for an offense which was wholly accidental." "That I can never do," Moses said. "This is wholly beyond my power. The king himself could not withstand the demand of the populace for his life. Until lately I might have in some way aided you, but I have no longer influence, and have myself fallen into disgrace at court." After again pacing the apartment for some time, Moses went on. "If you find this little Israelite maiden, tell her she is not the last of the Israelites who believes in the God of Abraham, our ancestor. Tell her that Moses also holds to the faith. You again look surprised, young man, and you may well be so, seeing that I have from the days of my infancy been separated from my people. But our priests keep accurate records of all things connected with the countries and religion of the people with whom we come in contact. Thus then it was easy for me, who have access to all the stores of knowledge, to examine the rolls recording the first coming of my people, the rule of Joseph, the great governor, the coming of his relations here and their settlement in the country. Thus I learned that they worshipped one God, whom they believed to be the only God in the world. I have been interested deeply in the learning of the priesthood, and have long seen that behind all the forms and mysteries of the Egyptian religion this central idea seemed to be hidden. None with whom I have spoken acknowledged boldly that it was so, but I heard reports that Ameres was bold enough to entertain the idea that there was but one God, and that our far back ancestors, who had first worshipped him under the various attributes they ascribed to him, came in course of time to lose the truth altogether, and to regard shadows as substances. Therefore, I said to myself, I too will believe in the one God worshipped by my forefathers, hoping that in time it may be that I may learn more of him. Until the last 2 or 3 years I have been content to live as one of the Egyptian princes, but of late my heart has turned much to my oppressed people, and I have determined upon doing what I can to relieve their burden. I have even raised my voice in the council in their favor, and this has created a coldness between the court and myself. They consider that I, having had the honor of adoption into the royal family, should myself forget, and allow others to forget, what they regard as my base origin. Sometimes I own that I myself wonder that I should feel so drawn toward them, and even wish that I could forget my origin, and give my whole mind to the duties and pleasures of my present rank. But I feel moved by a spirit stronger than my own. But we must talk no longer. I see that you are now stronger. Do you think you can walk?" "Oh yes," Amuba replied, getting up and walking across the apartment. "I have not lost much blood, and was only dizzy from their blows." "Then it is better that you should leave at once. The people from whom I snatched you will have carried the news speedily to the city, and officials will doubtless soon arrive here to demand that you be given up to them. Take therefore another draught of wine and a piece of bread. I will then give you in charge of a trusty slave, who will lead you through the garden and through a small door at the back, and will guide you to any spot where you may wish to go. Even now, doubtless, a watch is being kept up in the front of the house. When the officials arrive I shall tell them the truth, that coming, as I drove, upon a lad who was being attacked and murdered by a number of brutal peasants, I carried him off in my chariot. As to the shouts I heard, that you were the slayer of the Cat of Bubastes, I regarded it as an invention designed to hinder me from interfering on your behalf; that I questioned you upon your arrival here, and finding that, as I had supposed, you were entirely innocent of the offense charged against you, I urged you to leave at once, letting you depart by the garden gate in order to escape the fury of your persecutors. As you are not an Israelite, no one can suppose that I could have any motive for shielding an offender from the punishment of his crimes. Do not thank me, for time presses, and you must be moving, so as to be well away before it is known that you have left. May the God we both worship, though as yet in ignorance, guide and preserve you and carry you and your friends through the dangers that beset you." Moses drew back the curtains from before the entrance to the chamber and clapped his hands, and ordered the servant who answered the call to tell Mefres to come to him. An old slave speedily appeared, and Moses ordered him to take Amuba out by the private way and to guide him by quiet roads back to the city. Then cutting short his guest's expressions of thanks for the great kindness he had rendered him, he hurried him away, for he knew that at any moment the officials might arrive from the city. It was well that Amuba had been supplied with a guide, for upon issuing into the night air, for by this time darkness had fallen, he found that he could with difficulty direct his steps. His head throbbed as if it would split from the blows that had been dealt him, and every limb ached. The old slave, however, seeing that he stumbled as he walked, placed his staff in one of Amuba's hands, and taking him firmly by the arm led him steadily on. It seemed to the lad that he went on walking all night, and yet it was less than an hour after starting when his conductor found that he could go no further, and that he was wholly unable to answer his questions as to whither he wished to be guided. He determined to stop with him until he should be able to proceed again. He therefore led Amuba aside into an orchard, and there laid him down under the shelter of a tree, covering him with one of his own garments. "It is well for the lad that my lord arrived just when he did," he said to himself, as he sat down by the side of Amuba and listened to his heavy breathing; for all in the house had heard from the charioteer of the rescue of the lad from the hands of furious peasants. "He must have been very near death when he was saved from their hands. Maxis said that his assailants shouted out that he was the slayer of the Cat of Bubastes about which such a turmoil has been made. Had it been so, I do not think that my lord would have aided him thus to escape, though for my part I care not if he had killed all the cats in Egypt, seeing that in my native Libya we worship not the gods of the Egyptians." Several times during the night the old man got up and plucked large handfuls of grass wet with dew and placed them on Amuba's head, and when he perceived the first faint gleam of morning in the sky he aroused him. Amuba sat up and looked round with an air of astonishment. "Where am I?" he exclaimed. "You are at present in an orchard, my young friend, though to whom it may belong I know not. But finding that you were unable to continue your journey, I drew you aside here, and you have slept well all night, and I hope feel better for it and able to proceed." "I remember now," Amuba said. "It seemed to me that I walked for hours leaning on your arm." "It was but an hour," the slave replied. "We are not yet 2 miles from my lord's house." "And you have watched over me all night," Amuba said, "for it was, I know, but an hour after sunset when we started. Truly I am deeply indebted to you for your kindness." "Speak not of it," the old man replied. "My lord gave you into my charge, and I cannot return until I can tell him that you are in safety. But if you are able to walk we must pass on, for there may be a search for you as soon as it is light." "I am perfectly able to go on," Amuba said. "Thanks to the wet grass I see you have been piling round my head, the heat seems to have passed away and the throbbing to have ceased." Amuba was indeed now able to walk at a brisk pace. "Which way do you want to go?" the slave asked him in a short time. "It is getting light enough now for me to see your face, and it will never do for you to meet anyone. Your head is still swollen, and there are marks of bruises and cuts all over the scalp. Your appearance will attract attention at once, and if any saw you who had heard of last evening's doings, you would be at once suspected." "I will make direct for the hills," Amuba said. "They are not far distant, and I can easily conceal myself among the rocks until sunset." "Let us hurry on, then," the slave said. "It is but half an hour's walk, but as we may at any moment now meet peasants going to their work, I will go on ahead. Do you follow 100 yards behind me. If I see anyone coming I will lift my hand above my head, and do you at once step aside from the road into the vineyard or orchard, and lie there until they have passed." Amuba followed these instructions, and it was more than an hour before he reached the foot of the hills, so often did he have to turn aside to avoid groups of peasants. At last he reached the foot of the rugged ascent. Here he took leave of his guide with many warm thanks for his kindness and services, and with a message of gratitude to his lord. Then Amuba ascended the hill for a short distance, and laid himself down among some great boulders. Although greatly refreshed by his night's rest he was still weak and shaken, and felt altogether unequal to making his way along the hills for the 4 miles which intervened between himself and the hiding place of his friends among the tombs above the city. He was soon asleep again, and the sun was already some distance down the sky when he awoke. He waited until it sank behind the brow of the hill above him, and then climbing some distance higher made his way along the hillside, having little fear that his figure would be noticed now that the hillside was in shadow. Darkness had just fallen when he arrived at the tomb they used as their shelter. A figure was standing there in deep shadow. As he turned the path and approached, it advanced to meet him. Then there was a cry of joy, and Jethro sprang forward and clasped him in his arms. "My dear Amuba, I never thought to see you in life again." A moment later Chebron ran out, and in his turn embraced Amuba. "I shall never forgive you, and I shall never forgive myself," he said reproachfully. "What right had you to take my danger upon yourself? It was wrong, Amuba, and I have suffered horribly. Even though we are as brothers, why should you sacrifice yourself for me, especially when it is my life and not yours that is forfeited? I told myself 1,000 times last night that I was base and cowardly in allowing you and Jethro to risk your lives for me, when by giving myself up the rage of the people will be satisfied, and you could make your way out of this land without great danger. It was bad enough that you should share my risk, but when it comes to your taking it all upon your shoulders that I should escape free, I can accept such sacrifice no longer, and tomorrow I will go down and surrender myself." Amuba was about to burst into remonstrance, when Jethro touched him as a sign to be silent. The Rebu knew how acutely Chebron had suffered, and how he had spent the night in tears and self-reproaches, and felt that it was better to allow his present agitation to pass before arguing with him. "Are you hungry, Amuba?" he asked. "That I am, Jethro. I had nothing save a mouthful of bread since our meal here yesterday, and you will get no news out of me until I have eaten and drunk." A meal of cakes and cool fish and a draught of wine was soon taken, and Amuba said, "Now I will tell you all about it." "We know the first part," Jethro said. "When I returned here yesterday evening I found Chebron almost beside himself with anxiety. He told me how he had been discovered by one of the slaves of Ptylus, who knew him by sight; how you had attacked the slave, rescued him from his hands, and then joined him in his flight; how you insisted that you should separate, and how the pursuers had all followed on your track, leaving him to return here unmolested. He had been here upward of 2 hours when I arrived, and as the time had passed on without your return, he had become more and more anxious. Of course I at once started out to gather news, and had the greatest difficulty in persuading him to remain here, for he scorned the idea of danger to himself from the search which would be sure to be again actively set on foot. However, as I pointed out it was necessary that if you returned you should find somebody here, he at last agreed to remain. When I got into the town I found the whole city in the streets. The news had come that the slayers of the cat had been discovered, that one had escaped, but that the other had been overtaken after a long chase, and that he had been set upon and would have been slain, as he well deserved, had not one of the princes of the royal house arrived and carried him off in his chariot. The news excited the greatest surprise and indignation, and 2 officers of the city had gone out to the prince's mansion, which was 6 miles away from the city, to claim the fugitive and bring him to the town, when he would be at once delivered to the just anger of the populace. As soon as I learned this I started out along the road by which they would return, and hurried on past the people already gathered there. I had brought my sword with me, and my intention was that as the chariot returned with you, I would leap upon it, surprise and slay the officials, and drive off with you, for I knew you would be able to take no part in making the escape, as I had heard that you were already insensible when carried off in the chariot. There were groups of people all along the road with torches, but I thought that a sudden surprise would probably be successful. At last I heard the chariot approaching. It was being driven more slowly than I had expected. As it came to a large group of people some distance ahead of me, it stopped for a moment, and the official addressed the people. There was no shout or sound of exultation, and I felt convinced at once that either upon their arrival they had found that you were already dead, or that in some miraculous way you had escaped. I therefore hurried back to the next group. When the chariot came up there was a shout of, "What is the news? Where is the malefactor?" The officials checked their horses and replied, "A mistake has been made. The prince assures us that the lad was a poor slave and wholly innocent of this affair. He has satisfied himself that in their jealousy for the honor of the gods, the peasants who attacked the lad committed a grievous wrong and fell upon a wholly innocent person. After assuring himself of this, he had had his wounds bound up and suffered him to depart. The prince intends to lay a complaint before the council against the persons who have cruelly maltreated and nearly murdered an innocent person, who, he stated, interfered in the matter because he saw a slave attacking a young lad, and who fled fearing trouble because of the punishment he had inflicted upon the aggressor." The announcement was received in silence, but when the chariot had driven on again there was much murmuring. This account had certainly the appearance of truth, for it was already known by the narrative of the slave who recognized Chebron that the person who rescued him was a youth and a stranger to him, and that it was this youth who had been pursued, while Chebron himself had escaped. Still there was murmuring that the prince should in so important a matter have suffered the youth to depart without a more searching examination. Some said that even if the boy's story was true he deserved punishment for attacking the slave who had arrested Chebron, while others said that as he had certainly been beaten almost to death, he had been punished sufficiently. All agreed that no doubt the whole affair would be investigated. I hurried back again with the news, and all night we watched for you, and when morning came without your arrival we were almost as anxious as before, fearing that you had been too badly injured to rejoin us, and that today you would almost certainly be recaptured. As the search for Chebron would assuredly be actively carried out, I insisted on his remaining quiet here, while I made frequent journeys down to the city for news. But beyond the certainty that you had not been recaptured, although a diligent search had been made for you as well as for Chebron, I learned nothing. Now, Amuba, I have relieved you of the necessity for much talk. You have only to fill in the gaps of the story, and to tell us how it was that you persuaded this Egyptian prince of your innocence." "It is a rather long story, Jethro, but now that I have had a meal I feel strong enough to talk all night, for I have had nearly 24 hours' sleep. First I will tell Chebron that when I took the pursuers off his track I had no idea of sacrificing myself, for I made sure that I should be able to outrun them, and I should have done so easily had it not been for fresh people constantly taking up the pursuit and at last running me down." Amuba then related the whole story of his flight, his attack with the peasants, and his rescue, and then recited the whole of his conversation with his rescuer and his proceedings after leaving his house. "So you see," he concluded, "that strangely enough it was the teaching of your father, Chebron, and the tale that Ruth told us, and that her grandfather before told you of the God of their forefathers, that saved my life. Had it not been that this prince of Israelitish birth also believed in one God, it could hardly be that he would have saved me from the vengeance of the people, for as he says he is in disfavor with the king, and his conduct in allowing me to go free merely on my own assertion of my innocence is likely to do him further harm. This he would assuredly never have risked had it not been for the tie between us of a common faith in one great God." "It is a strange story," Jethro said, when Amuba brought his narrative to a conclusion. and you have had a marvelous escape. Had it not been for the arrival of this prince upon the spot at the very moment, you must have been killed. Had he not have been of a compassionate nature he would never, in the first place, have interfered on your behalf, and had it not been for your common faith, he would have held you until the officials arrived to claim you. Then, too, you were fortunate indeed in the kindness of your guide, for evidently had it not been for your long rest, and the steps he took to reduce the heat of your wounds, you must have fallen into the hands of the searchers this morning. Above all, I consider it extraordinary that you should at the critical moment have been rescued by perhaps the one man in Egypt who would have had the will and the courage to save you." Upon the following morning Jethro and Amuba succeeded with some difficulty in dissuading Chebron from his determination to give himself up, the argument that had the most powerful effect being that by doing so he would be disobeying the last orders of his father. It was resolved that in future as a better disguise he should be attired as a woman, and that the watch upon the house of Ptylus should be recommenced, but that they should station themselves further away. It was thought, indeed, that the search in that neighborhood was likely to be less rigorous than elsewhere, as it would not be thought probable that the fugitives would return to a spot where they had been recognized. Amuba's disguise was completely altered. He was still in the dress of a peasant, but by means of pigments obtained from Chigron, Jethro so transformed him as to give him, to a casual observer, the appearance of advanced years. They had had a long discussion as to the plan they would adopt, Amuba and Jethro wishing Chebron to leave the watching entirely to them. But this he would not hear of, saying that he was confident that, in his disguise as a woman, no one would know him. "We must find out which way he goes to begin with," he said. "After that none of us need go near the house. I will buy a basket and some flowers from one of the peasant women who bring them in, and will take my seat near the gate. By 3 o'clock Plexo will have finished his offices in the temple, and may set out half an hour later. I shall see at least which road he takes. Then, when you join me at dusk, one of you can walk a mile or two along the road, the other twice as far. We shall then see when he returns whether he has followed the road any considerable distance or has turned off by any crossroads, and can post ourselves on the following day so as to find out more." "The plan is a very good one, Chebron, and we will follow it. Once we get upon his trail I will guarantee that it will not be long before we trace him to his goal." Accordingly that afternoon Chebron, dressed as a peasant woman, took his seat with a basket of flowers 50 yards from the entrance to the house of Ptylus. At about the time he expected, Plexo and his father returned together from the temple. Half an hour later a light chariot with 2 horses issued from the gate. Plexo was driving and an attendant stood beside him. Chebron felt sure that if Plexo was going to visit Mysa he would take the road leading into the country, and the post he had taken up commanded a view of the point where the road divided into 3, one running straight north along the middle of the valley, while the others bore right and left until one fell into the great road near the river, the other into that on the side of the valley near the hills. It was this last that Plexo took, and although he might be going to visit acquaintances living in the many villas scattered for miles and miles along the roadside, Chebron felt a strong hope that he was going to Mysa's hiding place. As soon as it was dark he was joined by Jethro and Amuba. "He started at 3 o'clock," Chebron exclaimed as they came up to him, "and took the road leading to the foot of the hills." "We will go on there at once," Jethro said. "He may return before long, and we must hurry. Do you walk quietly on, Chebron, and stop at the point where the road ahead runs into the main road. Amuba shall stop 2 miles further. I will go 2 miles further still. If he comes along the road past me, we will begin at that point tomorrow." Jethro had but just reached the spot at which he proposed to wait when he heard the sound of wheels approaching, and a minute later the chariot drove along. The moon was not up, but the night was clear and bright, and advancing as close as he could to the passing chariot, he was able to recognize Plexo. The latter gave an angry exclamation as his horses shied at the figure which had suddenly presented itself, and gave a cut with his whip at Jethro. A minute later the chariot had disappeared, and Jethro returned toward the city, picking up on his way Amuba and Chebron. The next night Amuba took up his station a mile beyond the spot at which Jethro had seen the chariot, Jethro another mile ahead, while Chebron watched the crossroads near the town. But this time it did not come along, although Chebron had seen him start the same hour as before. "I hardly expected to see him tonight," Jethro said when he joined the others after fruitlessly waiting for 3 hours. "He will hardly be likely to visit her 2 days in succession. He will be more likely to leave her for a week, to meditate on the hopelessness of refusing to purchase her liberty at the price of accepting him as her husband. Doubtless he has today merely paid a visit to some friends." It was not, indeed, until the 4th night of waiting that Plexo came along. This time he did not pass Jethro at all, and it was therefore certain that he had turned off from the main road either to the right or left at some point between the post of Jethro and that of Amuba. When this was determined they agreed, after a consultation, not to return to their hiding places near Thebes that night, but to lie down under some trees by the roadside until morning broke, and then to examine the road carefully. It was not likely that another chariot would pass before morning, and they might be able to follow the tracks along the dusty road. In this way they discovered the road where he had turned off, but beyond this the tracks did not show, as the road was hard and almost free from dust. It lay, as they expected, toward the hills, but there were so many country mansions of the wealthy classes dotted about, and so many crossroads leading to these and to the farmhouses of the cultivators, that they felt they were still far from attaining the object of their search. After some discussion it was agreed that they should ascend the hills and remain there during the day, and that Jethro should return to the town as soon as it became dark to obtain a store of provisions sufficient to last them for a week. This was done, and the next day they separated at dawn and took up their places on the hills at a distance of about a mile apart, choosing spots where they commanded a view over the valley, and arranging to meet at a central point when night came on. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G.A. Henty. Chapter 15. Ameres Is Revenged. 6 days passed without their watch being rewarded. Then Chebron, whose post was just opposite the road where they had traced the wheels, saw a chariot turn from the main road into it. As many others had taken that course every day, he did not at first feel very hopeful, although the time precisely tallied with that at which Plexo should have arrived had he started at the same hour as before. As it came near, however, he became convinced that it was the vehicle he was looking for. The horses tallied in color with those of Plexo, and the color of his dress could even at that distance be distinguished. This time, however, he was not accompanied by a servant, but by a figure the whiteness of whose garment showed him also to be a priest. "That must be Ptylus," he said to himself, "my father's murderer. Would I were down by the edge of the road with my bow and arrows. High priest as he has now become, I would send an arrow through his heart." The chariot turned off by the road parallel to that which had been followed from Thebes, and so close to the foot of the hills that from Chebron's post he could no longer see it. As soon as it was out of sight he leaped to his feet and hurried along the hills to join Amuba, whose post was next to his own. He found his friend had already gone on, and he hurried breathlessly on until he reached Jethro, who had been joined by Amuba a few minutes before. "Have you seen them?" he exclaimed. "I have seen them and marked them down," Jethro replied. "You see that roof among those trees at the foot of the hill half a mile further along? They turned off the road and entered these trees. Our search is over at last." "What had we better do, Jethro? Wait until they have left again and then go down?" "No," Jethro said sternly. "There are 2 things to be done. The one is to rescue Mysa, the other to punish the murderer of Ameres. But even did we determine to delay our vengeance, I should say we must still press on. You saw that arch-villain Ptylus with his son. He has assuredly come for some purpose. Probably he may intend to terrify the girl until he drives her into taking some solemn oath that she will accept Plexo as her husband. What can a girl of that age do in the hands of unscrupulous villains like these? It may be that this fox Plexo has been trying flattery, and, finding that failed, has called in Ptylus, who can threaten her with the anger of these gods of hers, to say nothing of perpetual imprisonment and harsh treatment. We will therefore push on at once. Amuba and I carry our stout peasant staves, while you, Chebron, have your dagger concealed under that female dress. We shall have all the advantage of surprise in our favor. It is not likely that there are more than 1 or 2 men there, with perhaps a female servant. Ptylus would not wish the secret to be known to more than was absolutely necessary. Of course it is possible that the 4 men who carried her off may all be on guard there, but if so, it makes but 6, and what with the surprise, and what with their not knowing how numerous we are, that number should not be more than sufficient for us to dispose of without difficulty. At any rate, were there 20 I would not hesitate. Honest men need never fear an encounter with rogues." "Especially," Amuba said, "when the honest men possess such sinews as yours, Jethro, and a good heavy cudgel in their hands." Jethro smiled, but was in too earnest a mood to answer, and at once led the way along the hillside until immediately behind the house among the trees. Then they descended, climbing with some difficulty over the wall surrounding the wood, and entered the enclosure. Treading as lightly as possible, Jethro and his companions passed through the wood and made their way up to the house. It was small but handsomely built, and was surrounded with a colonnade supported by carved pillars. The garden immediately around it was evidently carefully tended, and the house, from its secluded position, was well fitted as a place of sojourn for a wealthy priest or noble desirous of a few days' rest and retirement from the bustle of the great city. As all were barefooted they passed across the garden to the colonnade without the slightest sound. As they reached it, Jethro held up his hand for them to stop, for the sound of voices came through the wide doorway of an apartment opening out to the colonnade. Both Chebron and Amuba at once recognized the voice of Ptylus. "I will put up with no more of this folly, Mysa. You should think yourself fortunate in the extreme in the position in which you are, belonging to a disgraced family, to receive such an offer as my son makes to you. I will have an answer at once. You will either swear before the gods that you accept Plexo as your future husband, that you will reply to all who question you that you have been staying here by your own free will, and that you remained in concealment simply because you were overwhelmed with horror at the terrible act of sacrilege committed by your brother, or you will this night be confined in a tomb, where you will remain alone and without the light of day until you agree to my conditions. You don't think, you little fool, that I, Ptylus, high priest of Osiris, am to be thwarted in my plans by the opposition of a child like you." Here a voice, which the 3 listeners recognized to their surprise as that of Ruth, broke out. "Do not listen to him, Mysa. Whatever comes of it, never consent to lie before God as this wicked man would have you. You call yourself a high priest, sir. What must be the worth of the gods you pretend to worship if they suffer one like you to minister to them? Were they gods, and not mere images of stone, they would strike you dead at the altar." A furious exclamation broke from Ptylus, and he stepped forward and seized the Hebrew girl roughly by the shoulder, only to start back with another exclamation as Ruth struck him with her open hand with all her force on the cheek. "Drag her hence, Plexo!" he exclaimed, but at this moment the entrance was darkened, and the 3 listeners sprang into the room. Ptylus had the courage that distinguished his race, and although for a moment startled at the sudden entry he did not recoil, but drawing a sword from his girdle he said haughtily: "Who are you, and what means this intrusion?" "We are those whom you have been hunting to death, Ptylus, and we come here as avengers of blood. As you brought about the murder of Ameres, so you must die, to say naught of your offense in carrying off the daughter of the man you slew." Without a word Ptylus rushed upon Jethro with his sword, thinking to make short work of this insolent peasant, but as he did so Jethro whirled his massive club round his head, and catching the blow upon it, shivered the sword in pieces. Ptylus stopped his arm, and gazing steadily at his opponent, said: "Wretch, do you dare to murder the high priest of Osiris?" "No," Jethro said, "but I dare to execute him," and he brought his heavy club down with all his strength upon the head of the priest. At this moment Plexo, who had stolen unobserved from the room the instant the others entered, returned, followed by 3 armed men. Chebron and Amuba were so intent upon the combat between Jethro and the priest that they did not notice the entrance of Plexo, who, with uplifted knife, sprang upon Chebron. There was a scream of warning, and quick as thought Ruth sprang forward and pushed Plexo as he sprang through the air. The sudden shock threw both to the ground. Ruth sprang to her feet again, but Plexo lay there motionless. The three armed men stood for a moment stupefied at the fall of their two employers, and then, seeing two men and a woman, rushed forward to attack them. One sweeping blow with Jethro's staff felled the first of his assailants to the ground, the others paused irresolute. "Drop your weapons or you are dead men," Jethro exclaimed. "You are outnumbered, and if you move, you die." As Chebron had now thrown back his female robe and drawn his dagger, and taken his place at the door, while Jethro and Amuba were advancing against them, the two men dropped their weapons. "Hold out your hands," Jethro said. "My son, stand over them with your club, and break the skull of either who may move." The men did as they were ordered. Jethro tore strips of cloth off their garments, twisted them into ropes, and bound their wrists firmly together. The meaning tone in which Jethro had called Amuba his son had not escaped either Amuba or Chebron, who saw that Jethro was desirous of concealing their names. Mysa, who had raised a cry of joy when Jethro first spoke, had sunk terrified upon a couch, and had hidden her face in her hands during the short encounter, while Ruth had stood silent and vigilant beside her, moving only when Plexo rushed at Chebron, and retiring to Mysa's side again as soon as she had regained her feet. She, too, understood Jethro's motives in calling Amuba his son, and stooping over Mysa she said: "It is all over now, Mysa, but remain quiet at present. Do not speak until you see what is going to be done." As soon as the men were tied, Jethro secured in the same manner the man who was lying stunned from his blow. Then he turned to Plexo, who had not moved since he had fallen. He half turned him round, and uttered a low exclamation of surprise. "Gastrion," he said to Chebron, "go with the young lady into the garden, and remain there until we join you." Chebron passed out onto the colonnade, following Mysa and Ruth. The moment they were unobserved Mysa threw her arms round him and burst into tears with joy. "Oh, Chebron!" she exclaimed, "you have arrived just in time. I thought we were never going to get away from that dreadful man, and I don't know what I should have done if it hadn't been for Ruth. And oh, they have been telling me such terrible things! But they can't be true, that our dear father had been killed, and that it was you, Chebron, who killed dear Paucis. But of course I did not believe them. I knew it was all their wickedness." "Never mind about that, dear," Chebron said. "We will talk about all this afterward. The first thing is to get you away from this place. Jethro and Amuba will soon decide what is best to be done. Are there any others in the house?" "There is one other man," Ruth replied, "and an old woman. I think the other man is at the door with the chariot." "I had better tell Jethro," Chebron said, and he again went into the room and told Jethro what he had heard. "We will seize the woman first," Jethro said, "and then go out round the house and come down from the other way upon the chariot. The man will have heard the outcry, and if we came suddenly out of the door, might leap into the chariot and drive off before we could overtake him. But if we come upon it from behind we shall secure him." "But you have forgotten to bind Plexo," Chebron said. "Plexo is dead," Jethro replied. "As he fell his arm was beneath him, and the knife with which he had intended to strike you pierced his heart. I am very glad that you observed the way I spoke to Amuba. It was of the greatest importance that the name should not be mentioned. This affair will cause a tremendous excitement. There is nothing to connect us with Ptylus, and it may be supposed that it is the work of some malefactors who came down from the hills in search of plunder. The fact that Mysa was here and was carried away is not in itself any proof that we had a hand in it, for Libyan robbers might well have carried her and Ruth away to make slaves of. Plexo caught but a glimpse of us, and doubtless only rushed out and called the men to come to his father's assistance. At any rate, let there be no names mentioned. Now let us finish our work here." The female servant was soon found and bound. Then the four prisoners were placed in different rooms, and fastened securely to the wall or pillars. "Never put two prisoners together," Jethro said. "Always remember that. Tie one man up and you may keep him. Tie up two and they are sure to escape. They can bite through each other's cords, or untie the knot with their teeth, or possibly even with their fingers." "Now, what is the next thing to do?" Amuba asked. "The next thing is to have a consultation. Do you, Chebron, go into the garden to the girls. Amuba and I will deal with the other man." As soon as Jethro and Amuba had left him Chebron rejoined the girls. "You saved my life, Ruth. I shall never forget it." "You saved me from the crocodile, my lord. It was but a push and he fell. I scarce know how it was done." "Your quickness saved my life all the same, Ruth. I had not noticed him till you cried out, and then it would have been too late. We have been anxious for you also, Ruth. We hoped that you might be with Mysa, but none saw you go out with her." "My place was with my mistress," Ruth said quietly, "and she was more than a mistress, she was a friend to me." "But how came you here, Chebron?" Mysa again asked. "And why are you dressed up like a peasant woman? It is not seemly in any man, much less in you, a priest. And Amuba and Jethro, too, they are dressed as peasants, and their faces seem changed, I do not know how. They look darker, and I should not have known them had I not recognized Jethro's voice." "It is a long story, dear, and I will tell you all presently, and we want to hear your story too. Ah, here come the others. It is to them, Mysa, far more than to me that you owe your rescue. I may know more of the learning of our people, but I have none of the readiness and coolness of Amuba, while Jethro is as prudent as he is brave. It would have fared hardly with me as well as with you, Mysa, had it not been for these good friends." Mysa went up to them as they approached. "Oh, Jethro, I feel how much I owe to you, and to you, Amuba. My courage had all but given way, although Ruth strove so hard to give me hope, and I fear I could not have long withstood the threats of that bad man. You cannot tell what joy I felt when I recognized your voice." "Our joy was as great in finding you as yours in seeing us," Jethro replied. "Amuba and I would gladly have laid down our lives for you. And now let us have a consultation. There is much to decide upon and arrange. Let us go round to the garden at the other side of the house. There we can sit and talk, and at the same time keep watch that no one else enters. It is not likely that anyone will do so, for the place is secluded, and none would know that these men were here. Still a peasant might enter to sell fowls or fruit, therefore it were best to keep an eye upon the entrance." They went round to some seats placed beneath trees on the other side of the house. A fountain worked by the water of a little rill on the hillside played in front of them, and a few tame waterfowl swam in a shallow basin around it. Everything was still and peaceful, and to Chebron it seemed as if the events of the last 3 weeks had been a hideous dream, and that they were again sitting in the garden of their house at Thebes. "Now, first of all," Mysa said, "I must have my questions answered. How are my father and mother and everyone?" Jethro took Amuba's arm and turned away. "We will leave you, Chebron, to tell Mysa what has taken place. It will be better for you to do so alone." Ruth rose from her seat to leave also, but Mysa put her hand on her arm. "I am frightened, Ruth. Stay with me." "You told me, Mysa," Chebron began, "that they had told you tales that our father was dead, and that it was I who killed Paucis." "Yes, but I did not believe them, Chebron. Of course I did not for a moment. At least not for a moment about you. But when I thought of those bad men at the gate and the crash we heard and the noise of the people rushing in shouting, I was afraid that perhaps it might be true about our father. But oh, Chebron, surely it is not so." "Alas, Mysa, it is true. They cruelly slew our father. I wish I had been there to have fallen by his side. But you know Amuba and I were away. Jethro fought desperately to the last, and would have died with him had not our father himself commanded that in case anything happened to him he was to take charge of me and to carry me out of the land." Mysa was crying bitterly now. Presently she looked up. "But why should you want to leave the land, Chebron? Surely it is not true that you—" The thing seemed too terrible for her to put into words. "That I killed poor Paucis? That is true also, Mysa." Mysa gave a little cry of horror. "Oh, Ruth!" she cried, "this is too dreadful." Ruth put her arms round the sobbing girl. "You may be sure, Mysa, that your brother did not do it intentionally." "But it is all the same," Mysa cried. "It was the sacred cat, you know, the Cat of Bubastes." "It was, Mysa, and I thought at first, as you did, that although it was the result of an accident the anger of the gods would be poured out against me, that I was as one accursed, whose life was forfeited in this world, and whose spirit was destined to dwell in unclean beasts after death. But when I told my father all, he reassured me, and told me not to fear in any way the wrath of the gods." He then related to his sister the manner in which the cat had been killed, the steps he and Amuba had taken to conceal the body, and his avowal to his father of his fault. "I see it was not your fault, Chebron, but you know the laws of Egypt and the punishment for killing even a common cat. How could our father say that the gods would not be angry?"
"I cannot tell you all he said, Mysa, though some day had I remained with you I might have done so. But he did say so, and you know how wise and good he was. Therefore I want you to remember what he said, so that when I am gone you will not all your life think of me as one accursed." "Oh, I should never do that!" Mysa exclaimed, starting up and throwing her arms round her brother's neck. "How could you think so? But why are you talking about going, and where are you going?" "I am going, Mysa, because the people of Egypt do not view this matter in the same light as my father, but are hunting all the land to find and slay me and Amuba; for, not knowing the exact truth, they put us down as equally guilty. So we must fly. Our father gave full directions to Jethro, and we should by this time have been a long distance away had it not been that we stayed to find and rescue you." "Then if the other things they told me are true, Chebron, it may be true too that the letter they showed me ordering me to consent to marry Plexo was from my mother. How could she tell me that when she knew that I hated him, and she has over and over again spoken scornfully of his family before me?"
"What did she say?" Chebron asked.
"She said that now disgrace had fallen on the family I might think myself very fortunate in obtaining such an offer."
Chebron was silent. He knew that his mother had never shown any earnest love either for Mysa or himself, that her thoughts were entirely devoted to dress and entertainments, and that any love she had to give had been bestowed upon his brother. "I fear it is true, Mysa."
"But I will never marry Plexo!" Mysa exclaimed passionately. "My father always said I should never marry a man I disliked."
"You will never marry Plexo, Mysa. He is dead." Ruth uttered an exclamation. "He died by his own hand, Ruth, that is, by an accident. As he fell his dagger pierced his own heart, and when Jethro went to look at him he was dead."
"The Lord requited him for his evil," Ruth said firmly. "All things are in his hands. As I did not mean to slay him, I lament not over his death. Besides, he strove to take your life, and had I had a dagger in my hand I should assuredly have used it." "Then what is to become of me?"
Mysa asked. "You must go back to your mother, Mysa. There is naught else for you to do."
"I will not!" Mysa exclaimed. "She never loved me. She would have married me against my will to Plexo although she knew he was bad, and that I hated him. She would make me marry someone else who was rich regardless of my wishes. No, Chebron, nothing shall make me go back to her."
Chebron looked perplexed. "Here come Jethro and Amuba, dear. You had best talk it over with them. I see nothing else for you to do." As Jethro came up Mysa walked to meet him.
"I will not go back to my mother, Jethro!" she exclaimed impetuously. "She wanted me to marry Plexo. She would give me to someone else, and my father always said I should only marry someone I liked. You can never be so cruel as to give me up to her."
"I know that your father's wishes were strong upon that point," Jethro said, "for he spoke to me of you when he gave me his commands respecting Chebron. He said that he wished that I could watch over you as over him, and it was because of what he had said that I disregarded his orders as to our instant flight, and lingered here in hopes of freeing you. Still I see not anything else to be done. Your mother doubtless wrote while still overpowered by grief at your father's loss, and thought that she was acting for your welfare in securing you an advantageous marriage in spite of the cloud under which your family was resting."
"I will not go to her," Mysa repeated. "She thought of herself as she always did, and not of me in any way. You know it was so, Chebron. You cannot deny it."
Chebron was silent. His whole affection had been given to his father, for his mother he had comparatively little. As a child he had seldom been allowed to come into the room where she was. She declared that his noise was too much for her, that his talk made her head ache, and that his fidgeting about was too much to be borne. Nor since that time had he been much more with her. It was his father who had seen to his welfare and that of Mysa, who would put aside his grave studies to walk and talk with them, who was always indulgent, always anxious to give them pleasure. He therefore thoroughly entered into Mysa's feelings, but saw no possible alternative for her. "But where could you go, Mysa?" Jethro asked. "Where could you be placed? Wherever you were your mother in time would be sure to hear of it and would reclaim you."
"I shall go with Chebron and you and Amuba," Mysa said positively.
"Impossible," Jethro replied. "We are going upon a tremendous journey, full of danger and fatigue. We are going among unknown and savage peoples. The chances are 100 to 1 against our ever arriving at the end of our journey. If this is so to myself and to young men like Chebron and Amuba, for they are now past 18, and will speedily be men, what chance would there be of success with you with us?"
"I can walk as well as Chebron," Mysa said. "You know that, Chebron, and I suppose I could suffer hardship just as well. At any rate I would rather suffer anything and be with him and all of you than stop here. The people have murdered my father. My mother would sell me to the highest bidder. If the chances are so great that you will never get through your journey in safety, my being with you cannot make them so much greater. I have only Chebron in the world, and I will go where he goes and die where he dies. The gods can protect me just as well on a journey as here. Have they not protected you now, and Chebron too, by what he says? You will take me with you, dear Jethro, won't you?" she urged pleadingly. "You say my father wished you to watch over me. Do not forsake me now. Ruth will come with us too. Will you not, Ruth? I am sure she will not be more afraid of the journey than I am." "I will assuredly go if you go, Mysa. The God of Israel can take us safely through all dangers if it be his will."
Jethro was silent. Such an addition to his charge would assuredly add immensely to the difficulties of the journey, but on the other hand he remembered the anxiety of Ameres about Mysa, and he asked himself what his late master would have wished had he known how matters stood. He glanced at Amuba and Chebron and saw at once that their wishes agreed with those of Mysa. He turned away abruptly, and for some minutes paced up and down the garden. Then he returned to the group, among whom not a word had been exchanged since he left them. "Mysa," he said gravely, "this is a great thing that you ask. There is no disguising that your presence will add greatly to our difficulties, will add also to our perils, and may render it impossible for me to carry out your father's wishes and to conduct Chebron to a land where he will be beyond the persecution of Egypt. Such an enterprise must be undertaken in no light spirit. If you go you must be prepared to face death in all forms, by hunger and thirst and the weapons of the wild natives. It may even be that your lot may be that of slavery among them. It is a terrible journey for men, more terrible still for women. Still, if you are resolved with the strength and mind of a woman and not of a child, that after having once turned your back upon Egypt you will never repent the step you have taken or wish to return, but will be steadfast under all the trials that may befall us, then I say that you shall share our lot." Mysa uttered an exclamation of joy. "I promise, Jethro; and whatever may happen, hardship, danger, or death, you shall never hear a word of complaint from me. Are you not glad, Ruth?" "I think it well," Ruth said gravely. "It is a great undertaking, but I think that God's hand is in it. I, too, would fain leave this land of idols, and except those here I have none in the world to care for." "And now, Jethro," Amuba said, "what had we best do? It is already almost dark, therefore we could set out at once. Could we make use of the chariot?" Jethro considered for a short time. "Except for carrying any things we may want for our first start, I do not see that we can do so," he said. "For where we leave the chariot tomorrow morning it would be found, and when it is known that Ptylus' chariot was missing it would soon be recognized as his, and thus a clue afforded to the fact that we had fled south. As to traveling in it beyond tonight, it would be out of the question. Besides, it will only hold 3 at the most. No, if we use it at all it must be to drive north, and so throw them off the scent. I think it will be worth doing that." "I will undertake that part of the business," Amuba said. "There will be much for you to do tomorrow, Jethro, which only you can arrange. There's the boat to be hired, stores laid in, and all got in readiness. I think the best plan will be for you both to start at once with the girls for Thebes. You and Chebron can occupy your hiding place on the hill, and Chigron will be glad to take the girls into his house. There is no danger of an immediate search being made for them. Tonight, when the priest and his son do not return, their servants will suppose that they have slept here. It will not be until late tomorrow afternoon that there will be any alarm or any likelihood of a messenger being sent over here. Then the consternation and confusion that will be caused will be so great that probably no one will think of carrying the news to the officials until the next morning. Besides, until the story of Mysa's having been here and of her being missing is generally known, there is no reason that what has taken place should be attributed to us. Therefore, for the next 48 hours, I think that they would be perfectly safe at the embalmers. I will drive the chariot 30 or 40 miles north, then turn the horses loose where they are sure to be noticed ere long, and will return on foot and join you in your hiding place tomorrow night." "I think your plan is a very good one, Amuba. Before we start I will make a search through the house. There will be nothing we want to take with us, nor would we want to touch any of the treasure of the villains were the house full of it, but if I toss some of the things about it will look as if robbery had been the motive of what has taken place. The men in bonds can know nothing of the real state of things. Plexo, when he rushed out for their aid, could have had no time to do more than to tell them to take up their arms and follow him. Indeed, it is doubtful whether he himself had any idea that we were aught but what we seemed. Therefore, the first impression assuredly will be that we were malefactors of the worst kind. Escaped slaves, men with no respect for the gods, for assuredly no Egyptians, even the worst of criminals, would in cold blood have laid hands on the high priest of Osiris." "They laid hands on my father," Chebron said bitterly. "Yes, but not in cold blood. Reports had first been spread among them that he was untrue to the gods, and then they were maddened by fanaticism and horror at the death of that sacred cat. But in cold blood, as I said, no Egyptian, however vile and criminal, would lift his hand against a priest. You may as well come with me, Amuba. It would be strange if one of us only took part in the search." In 10 minutes Jethro and Amuba had turned the place into confusion in forcing open chests and cabinets, and littering the floor with garments. Then taking a few of the most valuable vases and jewels, they threw them into the pond round the fountain, where they would be concealed from view by the water lilies which floated on its surface. They examined afresh the fastenings of the captives, and felt assured that by no possibility could they free themselves. "They will be sure to be freed by tomorrow night," Amuba said. "Otherwise I should not like to leave them here to die of hunger and thirst." "I should be only too glad," Jethro said, "if I thought there was a chance of their being here 40 hours instead of 20. Doubtless this is not the first evil business they have carried out for their villain master, and they may think themselves lucky indeed that we do not take what would be in every way the safest and best course, namely to run a sword through their bodies and silence them forever. If I thought they could tell anything I would do so now, but I really do not think that anything they can tell would add to our danger. Of course the priest's wife knows that Mysa is hidden here, and will proclaim the fact that she has been here and is now missing, as she would consider it might afford a clue for the apprehension of those who attacked the house and slew her husband and son. Therefore I do not see that there would be much to be gained by silencing these people, but if you think differently I will finish them at once." Amuba shook his head, for although human life in those days was thought little of, save by the Egyptians themselves, he shrank from the thought of slaying captives in cold blood. "No, they can tell nothing, Jethro. You had best be moving. There is nothing more to talk over. I think all our plans were arranged long ago, except of course that you must get rather a larger boat than you had intended, together with garments for the girls. I think it would be best that Chebron should still be disguised as a woman, but we can settle that tomorrow night. There is a good store of dresses for us to choose from at Chigron's." Amuba led the horses to a stone water trough and allowed them to quench their thirst. Then he mounted the chariot and drove off, while the rest of the party set out on foot for Thebes. It was so late before they reached Chigron's house that they thought it better not to arouse the inmates, as comment would be excited by the arrival of women at so late an hour and unexpected by the master. The girls, therefore, passed the night in the rock chamber behind the building, while Jethro and Chebron lay down outside. As soon as dawn broke they moved some distance away. Jethro went to the house as soon as there was a sign that there was anyone astir, and told Chigron that they had discovered and rescued Mysa. Chigron was much disturbed when he heard of the death of the high priest and his son. "I don't say these men were not villains, Jethro, but that 2 high priests should be slaughtered in the course of a month is enough to bring the anger of all the gods upon Egypt. However, the poor girls are not responsible for it in any way, and I will willingly shelter them, especially as it is but for one night; but I own that I shall be vastly relieved when I know that you are all fairly on your journey." "That I can well understand," Jethro said; "and believe me, the gratitude of those you have sheltered, which you will have as long as they live, may well outweigh any doubts that may present themselves as to whether you have acted wisely in aiding those who are victims to the superstitions of your countrymen." Chigron called his servants and told them that he had just heard of the arrival from the country of some friends, and ordered a room to be prepared for them. He then went out and returned an hour later with the two girls. He led them quietly into the house and direct to the apartment prepared for them, so that they were unseen by any of the servants. Then he called an old servant on whose fidelity he could rely, and charged her to wait upon them during the day, and to suffer none other to enter the apartment. He bade her convey the impression to the other servants that the visitors were aged women, and to mention that they intended to make a stay of a few hours only, until some friends with whom they were going to stay should send in a cart to carry them to their house in the country. The old woman at once prepared baths for the girls, and then supplied them with a meal, after which they lay down on couches and were soon fast asleep. For the excitement of the preceding evening and the strangeness of their position in the comfortless stone chamber had prevented their closing an eye during the night, and they had spent the hours in talking over the terrible loss Mysa had sustained and the journey that lay before them. Half an hour later Chigron went out again and was soon joined by Jethro, who had now resumed his attire as a citizen of middle class. It was necessary that Chigron should accompany him and take the chief part in making the arrangements, for although Jethro had learned, in his 2 years' captivity, to speak Egyptian fluently, he could not well pass as a native. Chigron therefore did most of the bargaining, Jethro keeping somewhat in the background. They first took their course down to the river bank. Here innumerable craft lay moored, for the Nile was the highway of Egypt, and except for short journeys all traffic was carried on its waters. As soon as it was known that they were looking for a boat they were surrounded by the owners of the various craft, each praising the speed, safety, and comfort of his boat. Chigron, however, was some time before he made his choice. Then he fixed upon a boat that seemed well suited for the purpose. She carried a mast and large sail to take advantage of favorable winds. She was light and of very small draught, and being constructed entirely for passenger traffic she had a large cabin, divided into 2 parts for the accommodation of ladies, the crew consisting of the captain and 4 men sleeping on the deck. "I think your boat will do very well," he said to the captain, "provided we can come to terms. My friend is going up with his family as far as Syene at any rate, and possibly on to Ibsciak. His business may take him even further. What will be your terms a week?" "I suppose my lord will provide food for the crew as well as for his own family?" "That will be the best way," Jethro said. "Then will he pay for extra hands where the current runs so strong that the crew cannot tow the boat unaided against it?" Jethro assented. "And will he return with it, or remain for a while at the end of his journey?" "It is probable that his business may detain him there for a considerable time," Chigron replied. "He has relations there with whom he will wish to make a stay. But this should make no difference. You will have no difficulty in obtaining passengers or freight for your journey down." It was a long time before a bargain was struck, for Chigron knew that the boatmen would consider it strange indeed were the terms he first asked to be accepted. But at last an arrangement satisfactory to both parties was concluded. It was arranged that the start should take place early on the following morning, and Chigron then proceeded with Jethro to make the purchases requisite for the voyage: mats, cushions, and curtains for furnishing the boat, cooking utensils and provisions for the crew and passengers. Of these, however, it was not necessary to take a very large quantity, as the boat would lie up to the bank every night near one of the frequent villages, and here there would be no difficulty in purchasing provisions of all kinds. Some jars of good wine were, however, among the stores purchased, and in addition to these were several bales of costly merchandise and a large stock of such articles as would be useful for trade with the natives of the wilder parts of the country. A supply of arms, bows, arrows, and lances, was also placed on board. It was late in the afternoon before all these things were got on board the boat and everything arranged in order. Having seen all complete, Chigron returned with Jethro to his house. Jethro, after seeing the girls, who had just woke up and partaken of a meal, went up to the hiding place on the hill, and found that Amuba had just joined Chebron there. "Is all going on well?" the lads asked as he entered.
"Everything is in readiness. The boat is hired and furnished. I have a good store of merchandise for trading in Meroe, besides trinkets of many kinds for the peoples lying between Meroe and the Red Sea.
So far everything promises well. The boatmen belong to the upper Nile, and their dialect differs too widely from that spoken here for them to be able to distinguish that I do not talk pure Egyptian. I wondered why it was that Chebron was such a long time in making his choice between the boats, when, as far as I could see, there were scores that would have equally suited our purpose. But I found afterward that it was the boatmen rather than the boat which he was selecting, and that he chose those coming from far up the river, partly because their speech differed so widely from that of Thebes that they would not detect the roughness of my tongue, and secondly because they would be more likely to continue the voyage further to the south than would the boatmen of this port, who would regard it as a serious undertaking to proceed beyond Ibsciak. Therefore we need fear no suspicion on the part of our boatmen. I suppose you disposed of the chariot as we arranged, Amuba?"
"Yes, I drove north for 5 hours and then turned aside into a wood. Here I loosed the horses so that they could feed as they chose. They would doubtless by morning stray into the fields, and so attract attention. Then there would be a search to see to whom they belonged, and the chariot would be found. By the time that the news spreads that Ptylus is dead, and also that his chariot and horses are missing, and have doubtless been taken off by those who had attacked him, the tidings that the chariot is found will have been taken to the nearest town, and it will shortly be reported all over the country that we are making north, and the search for us will be made in that direction only. Are you going back to the house, Jethro?"
"Yes. Chigron has given out to his servants that the visitors are relatives of mine, and as I have been frequently seen going in and out in this garb, they are now accustomed to me, and it will be natural for me to sleep there tonight and to start with them in the morning. We shall start exactly at sunrise. You had better wait at a distance from the house and follow us, coming up and joining us just as we reach the riverside. The boat will be taken above the city to the highest steps, and we shall be able to proceed to that point without entering the town itself. Be careful with your disguises. The news of the death of Ptylus will not, I hope, be generally known in the city until we are fairly afloat. Were it otherwise, it would be dangerous for you to run the risk of being seen abroad." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G.A. Henty. Chapter 16. Up the Nile. Late at night Jethro again went up to the hiding place on the hill. Chigron had just returned from another visit to the city. He said, "The whole of the town is in an uproar. The news that Ptylus and his son have been found slain has been received, and the excitement is tremendous. The death by violence of 2 high priests of Osiris within so short a time is regarded as a presage of some terrible national misfortune. That one should have been slain was an almost unprecedented act, an insult of a terrible kind to the gods. But this second act of sacrilege has almost maddened the people. Some regard it as a judgment of Osiris, and deem that it is a proof that, as a few ventured to whisper before, the death of Ameres was brought about by an intrigue among a party of the priests headed by Ptylus. Others see in it a fresh proof of the anger of the god against Egypt. The king himself will, it is said, take part in services of propitiation in the temple of Osiris tomorrow. Sacrifices are to be offered, they say, in all the temples. A solemn fast will be proclaimed tomorrow, and all the people, high and low, are to shave their eyebrows and to display the usual signs of mourning. So far I have heard nothing as to the fact that 2 girls who were in the house are discovered to be missing, but tomorrow, when those who were in the house are questioned by the magistrates, this fact will doubtless come out, and the men will own that by the orders of Ptylus they carried Mysa away at the time the attack on the house was made. At present, however, there is no question of women in the case, and I can go down to the boat with the girls in company with Chigron without any fear whatever. But it is better that you should not be with us when we embark, for when the matter comes to be talked over, someone who sees us embark might notice that our number tallies with that of the 3 persons present when Ptylus was killed, and the 2 missing girls. Therefore Chigron's opinion is that it will be safer for you to start at once and walk to Maita, a village 20 miles up the river. There the boat will lie up tomorrow night, and as soon as it is dark you can come on board. I shall tell the boatmen that I expect you to join us there, as you have gone on ahead to transact some business for me in the neighborhood." "That is certainly the best plan," Amuba agreed. "There are too many who know Chebron by sight for it to be safe for him to go down to the boat here and embark in broad daylight. I will take 2 hours' sleep before I start, for as I did not sleep last night, and have walked 40 miles since I left the chariot, I feel in need of a little repose before I start again. I was foolish not to have slept this afternoon, for I have since midday been hiding near, but there was so much to think about that I had no inclination to do so, especially as I believed that we would have a night's rest here." "I will wake you," Chebron said. "I have been asleep the better part of the day, having had nothing to do since we arrived here yesterday evening." Chebron sat watching the stars until he saw that they had made 2 hours' journey through the sky. Then he roused Amuba. Both now laid aside their garments as peasants and put on the attire prepared for them as the sons of a small trader. Amuba had submitted, although with much disgust, to have his head shaved on the night following the death of Ameres, and it was a satisfaction to him to put on a wig, for, accustomed as he was to see the bare heads of the peasants, it was strange and uncomfortable to him to be going about in the same fashion. As soon as they were dressed they started, made their way down to the bank of the river above the town, and walked along the broad causeway by the stream until within a mile or two of their destination. Then they turned off toward a clump of trees which were visible by the first gleam of dawn a quarter of a mile away. Here they slept for some hours, and late in the afternoon returned to the side of the river and strolled quietly along, watching the boats. Those in the middle of the stream were making their way down with the current lightly and easily, the crews often singing merrily, rejoicing over the approaching meeting with their friends after an absence of many weeks. The boats going up the stream were all close to the bank, the crews walking along the causeway and laboring at the tow ropes, for there was not enough wind to render the sails of any utility in breasting the stream. The craft were of various kinds, some shapeless and rudely fashioned, used in conveying corn from the country higher up down to Thebes, and now returning empty. Others were the fancifully painted boats of the wealthy, with comfortable cabins and sails of many colors richly decorated and embroidered. These were carrying their owners up or down the river, between their country mansions and the city. It was half an hour after sunset when the two friends arrived at Maita. Darkness falls quickly in Egypt after the sun has gone down, and their features could scarcely have been recognized had they been met by any one acquainted with them in the streets. The scene in the streets of the little village was a busy one. Its distance from Thebes rendered it a general halting place for the night of the boats which had left the capital early, and a great number of these were already moored off the bank, while others were arriving in quick succession. The boatmen and passengers were busy making their purchases at the shops. Fishermen, with well-filled baskets, were shouting the praises of their fish. Fowlers, with strings of ducks and geese hanging from poles from their shoulders, were equally clamorous in offering them for sale. The shops of the fruiterers and bakers and those of the vendors of the vegetables that formed so large a portion of the diet of the Egyptians were all crowded, and the wine shops were doing a brisk business. Chebron and Amuba made their way through the busy scene, keeping a sharp lookout for Jethro, for they considered it certain that owing to the early start the boat was to make it would have arrived there some hours before, and that he would be on the lookout for them. In a few minutes they saw him looking into one of the shops. He started as they went up to him and touched him, for he had not perceived them before. "All well?" Amuba asked.
"Everything has gone off admirably. We got off without the slightest trouble. But come on board at once. The girls are anxious about you, although I assured them that there was not the slightest risk of your being discovered on your way here."
So saying, Jethro led the way to the boat, which was moored by the bank 100 yards above the village.
"In order," Jethro said, "that they could make an early start in the morning, and be off before the rest of the boats were under way."
"Here are your brothers," Jethro said in a loud voice, as he stepped on board.
"I found them dawdling and gossiping in the street, forgetting altogether that you were waiting for your evening meal until they came on board."
Both entered the cabin, which was about 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, but not high enough for them to stand upright. The floor was spread with a thick carpet, cushions and pillows were arranged along each side, and thick matting hung from the top. In the daytime this was rolled up and fastened, so that the air could play through the cabin and those within could look out at the river. But at present it closed the openings and kept out both the night air and the glances of passers-by. At the other end was a door opening into the smaller cabin allotted to the girls. A lamp swung from the beams overhead. Mysa gave a cry of pleasure as they entered and was about to spring to her feet when Jethro exclaimed: "Mind your head, child. You are not accustomed to these low quarters yet."
"Thank the gods we are together again," Mysa said as Chebron, after embracing her, sat down on the cushion beside her. "I feel almost happy now, in spite of the dreadful times that have passed."
"It does feel homelike here," Chebron said, looking round, "especially after sleeping in the open air on the hard ground, as we have been doing for the last month."
"I should hardly have known you, Amuba," Mysa said. "You do look so different in your wig, and with your skin darkened."
"I must look horrible," Amuba replied rather ruefully.
"You don't look so nice," Mysa replied frankly. "I used at first to think that short, wavy golden hair of yours was strange, and that you would look better in a wig like other people, but now I am sorry it is gone."
"Here is our meal," Jethro said as the hangings that served as a door were drawn aside, and one of the men entered bearing a dish of fried fish and another of stewed ducks, which he placed on the floor. Jethro produced some cups and a jar of wine from a locker in the cabin, and then the men, by his orders, brought in a jar of water for the use of the girls. Then sitting round the dishes they began their meal, Jethro cutting up the food with his dagger, and all helping themselves with the aid of their fingers and pieces of bread that served them for the purpose of forks. Mysa had been accustomed always to the use of a table, but these were only used in the abodes of the rich, and the people in general sat on the ground to their meals.
"We have not begun our hardships yet," Mysa said, smiling. "I should not mind how long this went on. I call this much better than living in a house, don't you, Ruth?" "It is more natural to me than that great house of yours," Ruth replied, "and of course to me it is far more homelike and comfortable, for I do not think I was a favorite among the other servants. They were jealous of the kindness you showed me."
"There is one thing I wanted to say," Jethro said. "It is better that we should not call each other by our names. I am sure that the boatmen have no suspicion here that we are other than what we seem to be, but they can hardly help hearing our names, for all Egypt has rung with them for the last month, and it would be well if we changed them for the present. You must of necessity call me father, since that is the relation I am supposed to bear to you. Amuba can become Amnis, and Chebron Chefu."
"And I will be Mitis," Mysa said. "What name will you take, Ruth? There is no Egyptian name quite like yours."
"It matters not what you call me," Ruth said.
"We will call you Nite," Mysa said. "I had a great friend of that name, but she died."
"And there is one thing, Nite," Chebron said, "that I wish you to understand. Just now you spoke to me as my Lord Chebron. That sort of thing must not be any longer. We are all fugitives together, and Mysa and I have no longer any rank. Jethro and Amuba are of high rank in their own country, and if we ever get safely to their own people they will be nobles in the land, while we shall be but strangers, as he was when he and Jethro came into Egypt. Therefore any talk of rank among us is but folly. We are fugitives, and my life is forfeited if I am discovered in my own land. Jethro is our leader and guardian, alike by the will of our father and because he is older and wiser than any of us. Amuba is as my elder brother, being stronger and braver and more accustomed to danger than I, while you and Mysa are sisters, inasmuch as you are both exiled from your own land and are friendless save for each other and us."
"I am glad to hear you say that, brother," Mysa said. "I spoke to her last night about it, for she would insist on treating me as if she were still my servant, which is absurd and not nice of her when she is going out with us to share our dangers only because she loves me. It is I rather who should look up to her, for I am very helpless and know nothing of work or real life, while she can do all sorts of things. Besides, when we were captives it was she who was always brave and hopeful, and kept up my spirits when, I do think, if it had not been for her I should have died of grief and terror."
"By the way," Jethro said, "we have not heard yet how it was that you were together." We heard of your being carried off, but old Liptus told me that no one had seen aught of you."
"They were all scared out of their senses," Ruth said scornfully. "The men suddenly ran into the room and seized Mysa, and twisted a shawl round her head before she had time to call out. I screamed, and one of them struck me a blow which knocked me down. Then they carried her off. I think I was stunned for a moment. When I recovered I found they were gone. I jumped up and ran along the passage and through the hall, where the women were screaming and crying, and then out of the house through the garden, and out of the gate. Then I saw 4 men at a short distance off carrying Mysa to a cart standing 100 yards away. I ran up just as they laid her in it. One of them turned upon me with a dagger. I said, 'Let me go with her and I will be quiet. If not I will scream, and if you kill me it will only set the people on your traces.' The men hesitated, and I ran past them and climbed into the cart, and threw myself down by Mysa, and then they drove off."
"It was brave and good of you, Ruth," Jethro said, laying his hand on the girl's shoulder. "But why did you not scream when you first came out of the gate? It might have brought aid and prevented Mysa from being carried off."
"I thought of that," Ruth said; "but there were numbers of rough men still coming in at the gate, and knowing how the people had been stirred up to anger against us, I did not know what might happen if I gave the alarm. Besides, I was not sure at first that these men, although they seemed so rough and violent, were not really friends, who were taking away Mysa to save her from the popular fury."
"Yes, that might have been the case," Jethro agreed. "At any rate, child, you acted bravely and well. We were hoping all along that you were with Mysa, for we knew what a comfort you would be to her. Only, as the women all declared you did not pass out after her, we did not see how that could be. And now, Mytis and Nite, you had better retire to your own cabin to rest, for though you have both kept up wonderfully, all this has been a great strain for you, and you are both looking fagged and heavy-eyed. Tonight you can sleep in comfort, for the present, I think that there is no occasion whatever for the slightest anxiety."
It was some time before Jethro and his companions lay down to sleep. They talked long and earnestly of the journey that lay before them, and when they had exhausted this topic Chebron said: "Till now, Jethro, I have not asked you about my father's funeral. When is it to be? I have thought of it often, but as you did not speak I thought it better not to question you."
"I was glad you did not," Jethro replied. "It will be in about 10 days' time. As I believed you guessed, Chigron is embalming him. The process will not be completed for another 4 days, and, as you know, the relatives do not see the corpse after it is in the hands of the embalmer until it is swathed and in the coffin. Chigron has done so much that must have been against his conscience that I did not like him to be asked to allow you to break through that custom, which to him is a sort of religion. Besides, dear lad, I thought it better for yourself not to renew your griefs by gazing on a lifeless face. During the last month you have fortunately had so much to distract your thoughts that you have not had time to dwell upon your loss. Moreover, you have needed all your strength and your energy for your search for your sister, and right sure am I that your father, who was as sensible as he was wise, and the two things do not always go together, would be far better pleased to see you energetic and active in your search for your sister and in preparation for this new life on which we are entering, than in vain regrets for him. Therefore, lad, for every reason I thought it better to keep silent upon the subject. It may be a satisfaction, however, for you to know that everything will be done to do honor to the dead. The king and all the great men of Egypt will be present, and Thebes will turn out its thousands to express its grief for the deed done by a section of its population. Had it not been for the express commands of your father, I should have thought that it might have been worth while for you to present yourself on that occasion, and it may be that for once even the fanatics would have been satisfied to have pardoned the offense of the son because of the wrong done to the father. However, this affair of Ptylus puts that out of the question, for when it is generally known that Mysa was carried off when Ptylus was slain, public opinion will arrive at the truth and say that the fugitives of whom they were in search, the slayers of the sacred cat, were the rescuers of the daughter of Ameres and the slayers of the high priest.
"You are right, Jethro. It will be better for me not to have seen my father. I can always think of him now as I saw him last, which is 1,000 times better than if he dwelt in my memory as he lies in the cere clothes in the embalming room of Chigron. As to what you say about my appearing at the funeral, I would in no case have done it. I would 1,000 times rather live an exile or meet my death at the hands of savages, than crave mercy at the hands of the mob of Thebes, and live to be pointed at all my life as the man who had committed the abhorred offense of killing the sacred cat." The conversation in the cabin had all been carried on in an undertone, for although through an opening in the curtains they could see the crew, who had been eating their meal by the light of a torch of resinous wood, and were now wrapped up in thick garments to keep off the night dew, chatting merrily together and occasionally breaking into snatches of song, it was prudent to speak so that not even a chance word should be overheard. The boatmen, indeed, were in high spirits. Their home lay far up near the borders of Upper Egypt, and it was seldom indeed that they obtained a job which gave them the chance of visiting their friends. Thus the engagement was most satisfactory to them, for although their leader had haggled over the terms, he and they would gladly have accepted half the rate of pay rather than let such an opportunity slip. As Chebron finished speaking they were preparing for the night by laying down a few mats on the boards of the foredeck. Then they huddled closely together, pulled another mat or two over them, extinguished the torch, and composed themselves to sleep.
"We will follow their example, but a little more comfortably, I hope," Jethro said.
The cushions and pillows were arranged, the lamp turned low, and in a short time all on board the boat were sound asleep. No ray of light had entered the cabin when Amuba was awakened by a movement of the boat, caused by a stir among the crew. He felt his way to the door and threw back the hangings and looked out. There was a faint greenish yellow light in the east, but the stars were still shining brightly. "Good morning, young master," the captain said. "I hope you have slept well." "So well that I could hardly believe it was morning," Amuba replied. "How long will it be before you are off?" "We shall be moving in 10 minutes. At present there is not light enough to see the shore." "Chefu, are you awake?" "Yes," Chebron answered sleepily. "I am awake, thanks to your talking. If you had lain quiet we might have slept for another hour yet." "You have had plenty of sleep the last 24 hours," Amuba retorted. "Take a cloth and let us land and run along the banks for a mile, and have a bath before the boat comes along." "It is very cold for it," Chebron said. "Nonsense! The water will refresh you."
"Come along, Chefu," Jethro said. "Your brother is right. A dip will refresh us for the day."
The Egyptians were most particular about bathing and washing. The heat and dust of the climate rendered cleanliness an absolute necessity, and all classes took their daily bath. The wealthy in baths attached to their houses, the poor in the water of the lakes or canals. Jethro and the two lads leaped ashore and ran briskly along the bank for about a mile, stripped and took a plunge in the river, and were dressed again just as the boat came along with the 4 men towing her, and the captain steering with an oar at the stern. It was light enough now for him to distinguish the faces of his passengers, and he brought the boat straight alongside the bank. In a few minutes the girls came out from their cabin, looking fresh and rosy. "So you have been bathing?" Mysa said. "We heard what you were saying, and we have had our bath too." "How did you manage that?" Chebron asked. "We went out by the door at the other side of our cabin in our woolen robes, onto that little platform on which the man is standing to steer, and poured jars of water over each other." "And you both slept well?" "Yes, indeed, and without waking once till we heard Amnis call you to get up." "You disturbed everyone, you see, Amnis," Chebron said. "And a very good thing, too," Amuba laughed. "If we had not had our bath when we did, we should not have got an opportunity all day. Now we all feel fresh." "And ready for something to eat," Mysa put in. "What would you like, Mytis?" Ruth asked. "I am a capital cook, you know, and I don't suppose the men will be preparing their breakfast for a long time yet."
"I think that will be a very good plan, Mytis," Jethro said; "but we will divide the labor between us. The 2 boys shall stir up the brands smoldering on the flat stone hearth forward. I will clean and get ready some fish. Nite shall cook them, while Mytis shall, under her directions, make us some cakes and put them into the hot ashes to bake. We shall have to shift for ourselves later on. There is nothing like getting accustomed to it. Of course the men will cook the principal meals, but we can prepare little meals between times. It is astonishing how many times you can eat during the day when you are in the open air." In half an hour the meal, consisting of the fish, light dough cakes, which Mysa had with much amusement prepared under Ruth's directions, and fruit, was ready.
The latter consisted of grapes and melons. The meal was greatly enjoyed, and by the time it was finished the sun was already some distance up the sky. For an hour the party sat on the deck forward watching the boats coming down the stream and the villages on the opposite shore, but as the sun gained power they were glad to enter into the cabin. The mats were rolled up now to allow a free passage of air, and as they sat on the cushions they could look out on both sides. Day after day passed quietly and smoothly. The men generally towed the boat from sunrise until 11 o'clock in the day, then they moored her to the bank, prepared a meal, and after eating it went ashore if there were trees that afforded a shade there, or if not, spread out some mats on poles over the boat and slept in their shade till 3 o'clock. Then they towed until sunset, moored her for the night, cooked their second meal, talked and sang for an hour or two, and then lay down for the night. Sometimes the wind blew with sufficient strength to enable the boat to stem the string close in shore by means of the sail alone, then the boatmen were perfectly happy and spent their day in alternate eating and sleeping. Generally the passengers landed and walked alongside of the boat for an hour or two after they had had their early breakfast, and again when the heat of the day was over. It made a change, and at the same time kept their muscles in a state of health and activity.
"We may have to make long journeys on foot," Jethro said, "and the more we can accustom ourselves to walking the better."
The time passed so quietly and pleasantly that both Mysa and Chebron at times blamed themselves for feeling as light-hearted as they did, but when the latter once said so to Jethro he replied,
"Do not be uneasy on that score. Remember that in the first place it is a comfort to us all that you and your sister are cheerful companions. It makes the journey lighter for us. In the next place good spirits and good health go together, and although at present our life is an easy one, there will be need for health and strength presently. This flight and exile are at present blessings rather than misfortunes to you, just as Amuba's captivity following so closely upon the death of his father and mother was to him."
"I can hardly believe," Mysa said, "that we are really going upon a dangerous expedition. Everything is so pleasant and tranquil. The days pass without any care or trouble. I find it difficult to believe that the time is not very far off when we shall have to cross deserts, and perhaps to meet savage beasts and wild people, and be in danger of our lives."
"It will be a long time first, Mytis. It will be months before we arrive at Meroe, the capital of the next kingdom, which lies at the junction of the two great arms of this river. Up to that point I do not think there will be dangers, though there may be some little difficulty, for they say there are tremendous rapids to be passed. It is only lately that the king overran Meroe, defeated its armies, and forced it to pay tribute. But as there is a considerable trade carried on with that country, I do not think there is any danger of molestation. It is on leaving Meroe that our difficulties will commence, for, as I hear, the road thence to the east through the city of Axum, which is the capital of the country named Abyssinia, passes through a wild land abounding with savage animals, and again, beyond Axum, the country is broken and difficult down to the sea. Chigron told me, however, that he had heard from a native of Meroe who had worked for him that there is a far shorter road to the sea from a point at which the river takes a great bend many hundreds of miles below the capital. When we get higher up we can of course make inquiries as to this. I hope that it may prove to be true, for if so it will save us months of travel."
Several large towns were passed as they journeyed upward. Hermonthis, standing on the western bank, by which they were traveling, was the first passed. Then came Esne, with grand temples dedicated to Neph and Neith, and standing where the Nile valley opens to a width of 5 miles. Then they passed Elithia, standing on the eastern bank, with many temples rising above it, and with the sandstone rock behind it dotted with the entrances to sepulchres. A few miles higher up they passed Edfu. Above this the valley gradually narrowed, the hills closing in until they rose almost perpendicularly from the edge of the stream. Here were temples erected especially for the worship of the Nile, and of his emblem, the crocodile. It appeared to the Egyptians the most appropriate place for the worship of the river, which seemed here to occupy the whole width of Egypt. Here, too, were vast quarries, from which the stone was extracted for the building of most of the temples of Upper Egypt. 16 miles higher Ombi was passed, with its great temple in honor of the crocodile-headed god Sebak. Along this part of the river the country was comparatively barren and the villages small and far apart. In the narrow places the river at times ran so rapidly that it was necessary to hire a number of peasants to assist the boatmen to drag the boat against the stream, and the progress made each day was very slight. 4 days after leaving Ombi they arrived at Syene, by far the largest town they had come to since leaving Thebes. This brought the first stage of their journey to an end. Hitherto they had been traveling along a tranquil river, running strongly at times, but smooth and even. Before them they had a succession of cataracts and rapids to pass, and a country to traverse which, although often subjugated, was continually rising against the power of Egypt. At Syene they remained for 3 days. They would gladly have pushed on without delay, for although the Egyptian authority extended further up the river, Syene was the last town where the governor would concern himself with the affairs of Egypt, or where fugitives from justice were likely to be arrested. However, as it was customary to give boatmen a few days of repose after their labor, and before undertaking the still more severe work which lay before them, Jethro thought it better to avoid any appearance of haste. There was much to be seen that was new to them at Syene. A great trade was carried on with Meroe. Most of the merchants engaged in it dwelt here, buying on the one hand the products of Upper and Lower Egypt, and sending or taking them up the river, and on the other hand buying the products of Meroe and dispatching them to Thebes. The streets were filled with a mingled population: Egyptians with their spotless garments and tranquil mien, merchants absorbed in business, officers and soldiers in large numbers, for Syene was an important military station, officials belonging to the great quarries near, and gangs of slaves of many nationalities working under their orders. Wild-looking figures moved among the crowd, their garments thrown loosely round them, affording a striking contrast to the cleanness of those of the Egyptians, while their unkempt hair was in equally strong contrast to the precise wigs of the middle-class Egyptians and the bare heads of the lower class. Their skins, too, were much darker in color, though there was a considerable variation in this respect. Among them were a sprinkling of men of entirely different type, almost black in hue, with thicker lips and flatter features. These were Ethiopians, whose land lay beyond that of Meroe, and who had also felt the weight and power of the arms of Egypt. "These people of Meroe," Amuba said, "are very similar in features to the Egyptians, Chebron, and their tongue is also not unlike yours. I can understand their speech." "Our oldest books," Chebron said, "say that we are kindred people, and are Asiatic rather than African in our origin. The people of Meroe say that their far back ancestors came from Arabia, and first spreading along the western shore of the Red Sea, ascended to the high lands and drove out the black people who inhabited them. As to our own origin, it is vague, but my father has told me that the opinion among those most skilled in the ancient learning is that we too came from Arabia. We were not all one people, that is certain, and it is comparatively of recent years, though a vast time as far as human lives go, that the people of the Thebaid, that is of Upper Egypt, extended their dominion over Lower Egypt and made the whole country one nation. Even now, you know, the king wears 2 crowns, the one of Upper Egypt, the other of the lower country. Along the shores of the Great Sea to the west are Libyans and other peoples similar in race to ourselves. My father considered that the tribes which first came from Asia pressed on to the west, driving back or exterminating the black people. Each fresh wave that came from the east pushed the others further and further, until at last the ancestors of the people of Lower Egypt arrived and settled there. In Meroe the temples and religion are similar to our own. Whether they brought that religion from Arabia, or whether we planted it there during our various conquests of the country, I cannot tell you; but certain it is that there is at present but little more difference between Upper Egypt and Meroe than there is between Upper Egypt and the Delta." "And beyond Meroe the people are all black like those we see here?" "So I believe, Amuba. Our merchants penetrate vast distances to the south exchanging our products for gold and ivory, and everywhere they find the country inhabited by black people living in wretched villages, without, as it seems, any government or law or order, waging war with each other and making slaves, whom they also sell to our merchants. They differ so wholly from us that it is certain that we cannot come from the same stock. But they are strong and active and make excellent slaves.
Lying between Meroe and the sea, the country called Abyssinia is also inhabited by a race of Arab blood, but differing more from us than those of Meroe. They have great towns, but I do not think that their religion is the same as ours. Our traders say that their language can be understood by them, although more rough and unpolished. I have heard my father say that he considered that all the country lying east of the Nile, and of its eastern branch that rises in Abyssinia and is called the Takazi, belongs to Asia rather than to Africa." The party found that the death by violence of two successive high priests of Osiris was one of the principal topics of conversation in Syene, but none appeared to think that there was the remotest probability of any concerned in those occurrences making for the south. However, Jethro thought it prudent that the whole party should not land together, and therefore Amuba and Chebron usually went one way, and he with the girls another. They paid visits to the sacred island of Ebo opposite the town, and to the quarries of Philae, 4 miles away. Here they saw the gangs of slaves cutting colossal statues, obelisks, and shrines from the solid rock. First the outline was traced on the rock, then the surrounding stone was removed with chisels and wedges, and at last the statue or obelisk was itself severed from the rock. Then it was hewn and sculptured by the masons, placed on rollers and dragged by hundreds of men down to the landing place below the rapids, and these placed on rafts to be floated down the river to its destination. They saw many of these masses of stone in all stages of manufacture. The number of slaves employed was enormous, and these inhabited great buildings erected near the quarries, where also were barracks for the troops who kept guard over them. Watching the slaves at their painful labor, Jethro and Amuba were both filled with gratitude at the good fortune that had placed them with Ameres, instead of sending them to pass their lives in such unceasing and monotonous toil. Among the slaves were several whom, by their complexion and appearance, they judged to be Rebu. As at first all those brought to Egypt had been distributed among the priests and great officers, they supposed that either from obstinacy, misconduct, or from attempts to escape, they had incurred the displeasure of their masters, and had been handed over by them for the service of the state. Had the slaves been in the hands of private masters, Jethro and Amuba, who were filled with pity at seeing their countrymen in such a state, would have endeavored to purchase them, and take them with them upon their journey. This was out of the question now, nor was it possible to hold any communication with them, or to present them with a small sum of money to alleviate their misery without exciting suspicion. The whole party were heartily glad when on the morning of the 4th day after their arrival, the boat was pushed off from the shore, and the work of ascending the rapids began. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G.A. Henty. Chapter 17. Out of Egypt. The river had begun to rise before they left Thebes, and although it had not yet reached its highest point, a great volume of water was pouring down, and the boatmen assured Jethro that they would be able to ascend the cataract without difficulty, whereas when the Nile was low there was often great danger in passing, and at times indeed no boats could make the passage. 10 men were engaged in addition to the crew to take the boats up beyond the rapids. But though assured that there was no danger, the girls declared that they would rather walk along the bank, for the hurry and rush of the mighty flood, rising sometimes in short, angry waves, were certainly trying to the nerves. Jethro and the lads of course accompanied them, and sometimes seized the rope and added their weight when the force of the stream brought the men towing to a standstill, and seemed as if it would, in spite of their efforts, tear the boat from their grasp. At last the top of the rapids was gained, and they were glad to take their places again in the boat as she floated on the quiet water. So a month passed, sometimes taken along by favorable winds, at others being towed along quiet waters close to the shore, at others battling with the furious rapids. They found that the cataract they had first passed was as nothing to those higher up. Here the whole cargo had to be unloaded and carried up to the top of the rapids, and it needed some 40 men to drag the empty boat through the turmoil of waters, while often the slightest error on the part of the helmsman would have caused the boat to be dashed to pieces on the great rocks rising in the midst of the channel. But before arriving at the second cataract they had tarried for several days at Ibsciak, the city to which their crew belonged.
They had passed many temples and towns during the 180 miles of journey between Syene and this place, but this was the largest of them. Here 2 great grotto temples were in course of construction, the one dedicated to the gods Amun and Phre, and built at the expense of Ramses himself, the other dedicated to Athor by Lofreai the queen. On these temples were engraved the records of the victories of Ramses over various nations of Africa and Asia.
Jethro offered, if the boatmen wished to make a longer stay here, that he would charter another boat to take them further, but they declared their willingness to proceed at the end of a week after their arrival, being well satisfied with their engagement and treatment. After passing the second cataract they arrived at another large town named Beni. This was a very large city and abounded with temples and public buildings. The largest temple was dedicated to Thoth. All along the river a belt of cultivated land extended for some miles back from the bank. This was dotted with numerous villages, and there was no difficulty whatever in obtaining food of all kinds. At last they reached Semneh, the point to which the boatmen had agreed to take them. This was the furthest boundary to which at that time the Egyptian power extended. The river here took a great bend to the east, then flowing south and afterward again west, forming a great loop. This could be avoided by cutting across the desert to Merawe, a flourishing town which marked the northern limit of the power of Meroe, the desert forming a convenient neutral ground between the 2 kingdoms. Sometimes Egypt under a powerful king carried her arms much further to the south, at other times a warlike monarch of Meroe would push back the Egyptian frontier almost to Syene, but as a rule the Nile as far as Semneh was regarded as belonging to Egypt. The traders arriving at Semneh generally waited until a sufficient number were gathered together to form a strong caravan for mutual protection against the natives inhabiting the desert, who held themselves independent alike of Egypt and of Meroe, and attacked and plundered parties crossing the desert, unless these were so strong and well armed as to be able to set them at defiance. Erecting 2 tents and landing their goods and merchandise, Jethro and his party encamped near the river bank. They had not yet settled whether they would cross the desert or continue their journey by water. The choice between the 2 routes was open to them, for although the traders usually crossed the desert, taking with them their lighter and more valuable merchandise, the heavier goods made the long detour in boats, going up in large flotillas, both for protection against the natives and for mutual aid in ascending the rapids which had to be encountered. There was no difficulty in hiring another boat, for it was the universal rule to make a transshipment here, as the Egyptian boatmen were unwilling to enter Meroe. The transport beyond this point, therefore, was in the hands of the people of this country. In consultation with the traders gathered at Semneh, Jethro learned that it was by no means necessary to proceed up the river to the city of Meroe and thence eastward through Axum, the capital of Abyssinia, to the sea, but that a far shorter road existed from the easternmost point of the bend of the river direct to the sea. There were, indeed, several large Egyptian towns upon the Red Sea, and from these a flourishing trade was carried on with Meroe and Abyssinia. And the first merchant to whom Jethro spoke was much surprised to find that he was in ignorance of the existence of the route he had described. The journey, although toilsome, was said to be no more so than that from Meroe through Axum, while the distance to be traversed was small in comparison. After much consultation it was therefore agreed that the best plan was to dispose of the merchandise that they had brought with them to one of the traders about to proceed south, retaining only sufficient for the payment of the men whom it would be necessary to take with them for protection on their journey. Jethro had no difficulty in doing this, alleging as his reason for parting with his goods that he found that the expenses to Meroe would greatly exceed the sum he had calculated upon, and that therefore he had determined to proceed no further. As they thought it best to allow 6 months from the date of their departure from Thebes to elapse before they entered any large Egyptian town, they remained for nearly 2 months at Semneh, and then finding that a flotilla of boats was ready to ascend the river, they made an arrangement with some boatmen for the hire of their craft to the point where they were to leave the river, and again set out on their journey. The difficulties of the journey were very great. After traveling for some 60 miles they came to rapids more dangerous than any they had passed, and it took the flotilla more than a fortnight passing up them, only 4 or 5 boats being taken up each day by the united labors of the whole of the crews. There was great satisfaction when the last boat had been taken up the rapids, and there was a general feast that evening among the boatmen. During the whole time they had been engaged in the passage a number of armed scouts had been placed upon the rocky eminences near the bank, for the place had an evil reputation, and attacks were frequently made by the desert tribesmen upon those passing up or down upon the river. So far no signs of the presence of hostile natives had been perceived. The usual precautions, however, had been taken. The cargoes had all been carried up by hand and deposited so as to form a breastwork, and as night closed in several sentries were placed to guard against surprise. It had been arranged that the men belonging to the boats each day brought up should that night take sentinel duty, and this evening Jethro, his companions, and boatmen were among those on guard. Many of the boats had left Semneh before them, and they had been among the last to arrive at the foot of the cataracts, and consequently came up in the last batch. As owners they had been exempt from the labors of dragging up the boats, and had spent much of their time during the enforced delay in hunting. They had obtained dogs and guides from the village at the foot of the cataracts, and had had good sport among the ibex which abounded in the rocky hills. The girls had seldom left their cabin after leaving Semneh. There was nothing remarkable in the presence of women in a boat going so far up the river, as many of the traders took their wives on their journeys with them. When, however, they journeyed beyond Semneh they left them there until their return, the danger and hardships of the desert journey being too great for them to encounter, and it was therefore thought advisable that the girls should remain in seclusion. Jethro, Amuba, and Chebron were standing together at one of the angles of the encampment when the former suddenly exclaimed: "There are men or animals moving on that steep hill opposite. I thought several times I heard the sound of stones being displaced. I certainly heard them then." Then turning round he raised his voice. "I can hear sounds on the hill. It were best that all stood to their arms and prepare to resist an attack." In an instant the sound of song and laughter ceased amid the groups assembled round the fires, and each man seized his arms. There was a sharp ringing sound close to Jethro, and stooping he picked up an arrow which had fallen close to him. "It is an enemy," he shouted. "Draw up close to the breastwork and prepare to receive them. Scatter the fires at once and extinguish the blazing brands. They can see us, while themselves invisible." As he spoke a loud and terrible yell rose from the hillside, and a shower of arrows was poured into the encampment. Several men fell, but Jethro's orders were carried out and the fires promptly extinguished. "Stoop down behind the breastwork," Jethro shouted, "until they are near enough for you to take aim. Have your spears ready to check their onslaught when they charge." Although Jethro held no position entitling him to command, his orders were as promptly obeyed as if he had been in authority. The men recognized at once, by the calmness of his tones, that he was accustomed to warfare, and readily yielded to him obedience. In a minute or two a crowd of figures could be seen approaching, and the Egyptians, leaping to their feet, poured in a volley of arrows. The yells and screams which broke forth testified to the execution wrought in the ranks of the enemy, but without a check they still rushed forward. The Egyptians discharged their arrows as fast as they could during the few moments left them, and then, as the natives rushed at the breastwork, they threw down their bows, and grasping the spears, maces, swords, axes, or staves with which they were armed, boldly met the foe. For a few minutes the contest was doubtful, but encouraged by the shouts of Jethro, whose voice could be heard above the yells of the natives, the Egyptians defended their position with vigor and courage. As fast as the natives climbed over the low breastwork of merchandise they were either speared or cut down, and after 10 minutes' fierce fighting their attack ceased as suddenly as it had begun, and as if by magic a dead silence succeeded the din of battle.
"You have done well, comrades," Jethro said, "and defeated our assailants; but we had best stand to arms for a while, for they may return. I do not think they will, for they have found us stronger and better prepared for them than they had expected. Still, as we do not know their ways, it were best to remain on our guard."
An hour later, as nothing had been heard of the enemy, the fires were relighted and the wounded attended to. 16 men had been shot dead by the arrows of the assailants, and some 50 were more or less severely wounded by the same missiles, while 18 had fallen in the hand-to-hand contest at the breastwork. 37 natives were found dead inside the breastwork. How many had fallen before the arrows of the defenders the latter never knew, for it was found in the morning that the natives had carried off their killed and wounded who fell outside the enclosure. As soon as the fighting was over Chebron ran down to the boat to allay the fears of the girls and assure them that none of their party had received a serious wound, Jethro alone having been hurt by a spear thrust, which, however, glanced off his ribs, inflicting only a flesh wound, which he treated as of no consequence whatever.
"Why did not Amuba come down with you?" Mysa asked. "Are you sure that he escaped without injury?"
"I can assure you that he has not been touched, Mysa, but we are still on guard. For it is possible that the enemy may return again, although we hope that the lesson has been sufficient for them."
"Were you frightened, Chebron?"
"I felt a little nervous as they were coming on, but when it came to hand fighting I was too excited to think anything about the danger. Besides, I was standing between Jethro and Amuba, and they have fought in great battles, and seemed so quiet and cool that I could scarcely feel otherwise. Jethro took the command of everyone, and the rest obeyed him without question. But now I must go back to my post. Jethro told me to slip away to tell you that we were all safe, but I should not like not to be in my place if they attack again."
"I have often wondered, Ruth," Mysa said when Chebron had left them, "what we should have done if it had not been for Jethro and Amuba. If it had not been for them I should have been obliged to marry Plexo, and Chebron would have been caught and killed at Thebes. They arrange everything, and do not seem afraid in the slightest." "I think your brother is brave too," Ruth said, "and they always consult with him about their plans." "Yes, but it is all their doing," Mysa replied. "Chebron, before they came, thought of nothing but reading, and was gentle and quiet. I heard one of the slaves say to another that he was more like a girl than a boy. But being with Amuba has quite altered him. Of course he is not as strong as Amuba, but he can walk and run and shoot an arrow and shoot a javelin at a mark almost as well as Amuba can. Still he has not so much spirit. I think Amuba always speaks decidedly, while Chebron hesitates to give an opinion." "But your brother has a great deal more learning than Amuba, and so his opinion ought to be worth more, Mysa." "Oh, yes, if it were about history or science, for anything of that sort of course it would, Ruth, but not about other things. Of course it is natural that they should be different, because Amuba is the son of a king." "The son of a king?" Ruth repeated in surprise. "Yes, I heard it when he first came, only father said it was not to be mentioned, because if it were known he would be taken away from us and kept as a royal slave at the palace. But he is really the son of a king, and as his father is dead he will be king himself when he gets back to his own country." "And Jethro is one of the same people, is he not?" Ruth asked. "Oh, yes, they are both Rebu. I think Jethro was one of the king's warriors." "That accounts," Ruth said, "for what has often puzzled me. Jethro is much the oldest of our party, and altogether the leader, and yet I have observed that he always speaks to Amuba as if the latter were the chief." "I have not noticed that," Mysa said, shaking her head; "but I do know, now that you mention it, that he always asked Amuba's opinion before giving his own." "I have constantly noticed it, Mysa, and I wondered that since he and Amuba were your father's slaves he should always consult Amuba instead of your brother; but I understand now. That accounts too for Amuba giving his opinion so decidedly. Of course in his own country Amuba was accustomed to have his own way. I am glad of that, for I like Amuba very much, and it vexed me sometimes to see him settling things when Jethro is so much older. And you think if he ever gets back to his own country he will be king?" "I am not sure," Mysa said doubtfully. "Of course he ought to be. I suppose there is some other king now, and he might not like to give up to Amuba."
"I don't suppose we shall ever get there," Ruth said. "Amuba said the other day that this country lay a great distance further than the land of my people came from a long time ago." "But that is not so very far, Ruth. You said that the caravans went in 6 or 7 days from that part of Egypt where you dwelt to the east of the Great Sea where your fathers came from. But we are a long way from there, Mysa. But if it is only 6 or 7 days' journey, why did not your people go back again, Ruth?" "They always hoped to go back some day, Mysa, but I don't think your people would have let them go. You see, they made them useful for building and cutting canals and other work. Besides, other people dwell now in the land they came from, and these would not turn out unless they were beaten in battle. My people are not accustomed to fight. Besides, they have stopped so long that they have become as the Egyptians. For the most part they talk your language, although some have also preserved the knowledge of their own tongue. They worship your gods, and if they were not forced to labor against their will, I think now that most of them would prefer to live in ease and plenty in Egypt rather than journey into a strange country, of which they know nothing except that their forefathers hundreds of years ago came thence. But here are the others," she broke off as the boat heeled suddenly over as someone sprang on board. "Now we shall hear more about the fighting." The next day the journey was continued, and without further adventure the flotilla arrived at last at the town where the party would leave the river and strike for the coast. Having unloaded their goods and discharged the boat, Jethro hired a small house until arrangements were made for their journey to the seacoast. El Makrif was a place of no great importance. A certain amount of trade was carried on with the coast, but most of the merchants trading with Meroe preferred the longer but safer route through Axum. Still parties of travelers passed up and down and took boat there for Meroe, but there was an absence of the temples and great buildings which had distinguished every town they had passed between Thebes and Semneh. Jethro upon inquiry found that there were wells at the camping places along the whole route. The people were wild and savage, the Egyptian power extending only from the seashore to the foot of the hills, some 15 miles away. Occasionally expeditions were got up to punish the tribesmen for their raids upon the cultivated land of the coast, but it was seldom that the troops should come upon them, for, knowing every foot of the mountains, these eluded all search by their heavy armed adversaries. Jethro found that the custom was for merchants traveling across this country to pay a fixed sum in goods for the right of passage. There were 2 chiefs claiming jurisdiction over the road, and a messenger was at once dispatched to the nearest of these with the offer of the usual payment and a request for an escort. A week later 4 wild-looking figures presented themselves at the house and stated that they were ready to conduct the travelers through their chief's territory. Jethro had already made arrangements with the head man of the place to furnish him with 12 men to carry the provisions necessary for the journey, and upon the following morning the party started, and Mysa and Ruth assumed the garb of boys, Jethro finding that although traders might bring up the ladies of their family to Semneh, or even take them higher up the river in boats, they would never think of exposing them to the fatigue of a journey across the mountains, and that the arrival of 2 girls at the Egyptian town on the sea would therefore assuredly attract remark, and possibly inquiry, on the part of the authorities. For the first few hours the girls enjoyed the change of traveling after the long confinement on the boat, but long before nightfall they longed for the snug cushions and easy life they had left behind. The bearers, heavy laden as they were, proceeded at a steady pace that taxed the strength of the girls to keep up with after the first few miles were passed. The heat of the sun was intense. The country after a short distance had been passed became barren and desolate. They did not suffer from thirst, for an ample supply of fruit was carried by one of the bearers, but their limbs ached, and their feet, unused to walking, became tender and painful. "Can we not stop for a while, Jethro?"
Mysa asked beseechingly. Jethro shook his head.
"We must keep on to the wells. They are 2 hours further yet. They told us at starting that the first day's journey was 6 hours steady walking."
Mysa was about to say that she could walk no further, when Ruth whispered in her ear,
"We must not give way, Mysa. You know we promised that if they would take us with them, we would go through all difficulties and dangers without complaining." The admonition had its effect. Mysa felt ashamed that she had been on the point of giving way on the very first day of their starting on their real journey, and struggled bravely on; but both girls were utterly exhausted by the time they arrived at the wells. They felt rewarded, however, for their sufferings by the hearty commendation Jethro bestowed upon them.
"You have held on most bravely," he said, "for I could see you were terribly fatigued. I am afraid you will find it very hard work just at first, but after that it will be more easy to you. Tomorrow's journey is a shorter one."
It was well that it was so, for the girls were limping even at the start, and needed the assistance of Jethro and the boys to reach the next halting place, and as soon as the tent, which was separated into two parts by hangings, was erected, they dropped upon their cushions, feeling that they could never get through another day's suffering like that they had just passed. Jethro saw that this was so, and told their escort that he must halt next day, for that his young sons had been so long in the boat that the fatigue had quite overcome them. He accompanied the intimation with a present to each of the four men. They offered no objections, while the porters, who were paid by the day, were well contented with the halt. The day's rest greatly benefited the girls, but it was not long enough to be of any utility to their feet. These, however, they wrapped in bandages, and started in good spirits when the porters took up the loads. They were now following the course of what in wet weather was a stream in the mountains. Sometimes the hills on either side receded a little, at others they rose almost perpendicularly on either side of the stream, and they had to pick their way among great boulders and rocks. This sort of walking, however, tired the girls less than progressing along a level. Their feet were painful, but the soft bandages in which they were enveloped hurt them far less than the sandals in which they had at first walked, and they arrived at the halting place in much better condition than on the previous occasions.
"The worst is over now," Jethro said to them encouragingly. "You will find each day's work come easier to you. You have stood it far better than I expected, and I feel more hopeful now that we shall reach the end of our journey in safety than I have done since the evening when I first agreed to take you with us." While passing through some of the ravines the party had been greatly amused by the antics of troops of apes. Sometimes these sat tranquilly on the hillside, the elder gravely surveying the little caravan, the younger frisking about perfectly unconcerned. Sometimes they would accompany them for a considerable distance, making their way along the rough stones of the hillside at a deliberate pace, but yet keeping up with the footmen below. As the ape was a sacred animal in Egypt, Mysa was gladdened by their sight, and considered it a good omen for the success of their journey. The men who escorted them told them that if undisturbed the apes never attack travelers, but if molested they would at once attack in a body, with such a fury that even 4 or 5 travelers together would have but little chance of escape with their lives. During the first week's journey they saw no other animals, although at night they heard the cries of hyenas, who often came close up to the encampment, and once or twice a deep roar which their guide told them was that of a lion. On the 7th day, however, soon after they had started upon their march, the sound of breaking branches was heard among some trees a short distance up the hillside, and immediately afterward the heads of 4 or 5 great beasts could be seen above the mimosa bushes which extended from the wood to the bottom of the hill. The bearers gave a cry of terror, and throwing down their loads took to their heels. The 4 men of the escort stood irresolute. Although none of Jethro's party had ever before seen an elephant, they knew from pictures and carvings, and from the great statues in the island of Elephanta, what these great creatures were. "Will they attack us?" Jethro asked the men.
"They do not often do so," one of them replied, "although at times they come down and waste the fields round villages, and will sometimes slay any they come across. But it is best to get out of their way." Jethro pointed out a few of the more valuable packages, and taking these up they entered the bushes on the other slope of the hill and made their way among them as far as they could. This was, however, but a short distance, for they were full of sharp thorns and offered terrible obstacles to passage. All of the party received severe scratches, and their garments suffered much, in making their way but 20 yards into the bush.
"That will do," Jethro said. "We shall be torn to pieces if we go further, and we are as much concealed from sight here as we should be another 100 yards further. I will see what they are doing."
Standing up and looking cautiously through the screen of feathery leaves, Jethro saw that the elephants were standing immovable. Their great ears were erected and their trunks outstretched as if scenting the air. After 2 or 3 minutes' hesitation they continued to descend the hill.
"Are they afraid of man?"
Jethro asked one of the escort.
"Sometimes they are seized with a panic and fly at the approach of a human being, but if attacked they will charge any number without hesitation."
"Do you ever hunt them?"
"Sometimes, but always with a great number of men. It is useless to shoot arrows at them, the only way is to crawl out behind and cut the back sinews of their legs. It needs a strong man and a sharp sword, but it can be done. Then they are helpless, but even then it is a long work to dispatch them. Generally we drive them from our villages by lighting great fires and making noises. Solitary elephants are more dangerous than a herd. I have known one of them kill a dozen men, seizing some in his trunk and throwing them in the air as high as the top of a lofty tree, dashing others to the ground and kneeling upon them until every bone is crushed to pieces."
The elephants had now reached the bottom of the valley, and the chief of the escort held up his hand for perfect silence. All were prepared to fight if the elephants pursued them into the bushes, for further retreat was impossible. Amuba and Chebron had fitted their arrows into the bowstrings and loosened their swords in the scabbards. The 4 natives had drawn the short heavy swords they carried, while Jethro grasped the axe that was his favorite weapon.
"Remember," he had whispered to the boys, "the back sinews of the legs are the only useful point to aim at. If they advance, separate, and if they make toward the girls, try to get behind them and hamstring them."
There was a long pause of expectation. The elephants could be heard making a low snorting noise with their trunks, and Jethro at last raised himself sufficiently to look through the bushes at what was going on. The elephants were examining the bundles that had been thrown down.
"I believe that they are eating up our food," he whispered as he sat down again.
Half an hour elapsed, and then there was a sound of breaking the bushes. Jethro again looked out.
"Thank the gods!" he exclaimed. "They are going off again."
Trampling down the mimosa thicket as if it had been grass, the elephants ascended the opposite hill and at last re-entered the wood from which they had first emerged. The fugitives waited for a quarter of an hour and then made their way out again from the thicket, Jethro cutting a path with his axe through the thorns. An exclamation of surprise broke from them as they gained the open ground. The whole of their stores were tossed about in the wildest confusion. Every one of the packages had been opened. Tents, garments, and carpets hung upon the bushes as if the animals had tossed them contemptuously there, as being unfit to eat. Everything eatable had disappeared. The fruit, grain, and vegetables had been completely cleared up. The skins of wine were bursted, but the contents had been apparently appreciated, for none remained in the hollows of the rocks.
"What greedy creatures!" Mysa exclaimed indignantly. "They have not left us a single thing."
"They do not often get a chance of such dainty feeding," Amuba said. "I don't think we ought to blame them, especially as they do not seem to have done very much damage to our other goods."
"Look how they have trampled down the bushes as they went through. I wish their skins were as thin as mine," Mysa said as she wiped away the blood from a deep scratch on her cheek. "They would keep up in their own woods then and not come down to rob travelers."
"At any rate, Mysa, we ought to feel indebted to them," Chebron said, "for not having pushed their investigations further. We should have had no chance either of escape or resistance in these bushes. Jethro told us to move round and attack them from behind, but moving round in these thorns is all very well to talk about, but quite impossible to do. 2 minutes of active exercise and there would not be a morsel of flesh left on one's bones." It was 2 or 3 hours before the bearers came back one by one. They were assailed with fierce reproaches by Jethro for the cowardice which had been the means of losing all the provisions. 4 of their number were at once paid off and sent back, as there was no longer anything for them to carry. The others would have left also had it not been for the escort, who threatened death if they did not at once take up their burdens and proceed. For Jethro had been liberal with his stores, and they were as indignant as he was himself at the sudden stoppage of their rations. 3 days later they arrived at a small village, which marked the commencement of the territory of the second chief through whose country the road ran. Here the escort and carriers left them, their place being supplied by natives of the village. There was no difficulty in obtaining a supply of grain and goat's milk cheese, but these were a poor substitute for the stores that the elephants had devoured. They were too glad, however, at having accomplished half the toilsome journey to murmur at trifles, and after a day's halt proceeded on their way. Another fortnight's travel and they stood on the lower slopes of the hills, and saw across a wide belt of flat country the expanse of the sea glistening in the sun. 2 more days' journey and they reached the Egyptian trading station. This was situated on a little peninsula connected with the mainland by a narrow neck of land, across which a massive wall had been built to repulse the attacks of the wild tribesmen, who frequently swept down and devastated the cultivated fields up to the very wall. As soon as they entered the town Jethro was ordered by an official to accompany him to the house of the governor. Taking Chebron with him, he left it to Amuba to arrange for the use of a small house during their stay. The governor's inquiries were limited to the state of the country, the behavior of the tribesmen along the road, the state of the wells, and the amount of provisions obtainable along the line of route. "There are a party of Arab traders from the other side who wish to pass up to carry their goods either to Semneh or Meroe, but I have detained them until news should reach me from above, for if any wrong should happen to them their countrymen might probably enough hold us responsible for their deaths, and this might lead to quarrels and loss of trade. But since you have passed through with so small a party there can be no fear, and they can arrange with the people who brought you down as to the amount to be paid to the chiefs for free passage." He inquired Jethro's reason for making the journey over the mountains instead of proceeding by the Nile. He replied that he had received an advantageous offer for all his merchandise, and had disposed of it to a trader going up to Meroe, and that as the Nile had now fallen and the danger in passing down the cataracts was considerable, he thought it better to make the short land journey and to travel by sea to Lower Egypt, especially as he was told that the natives were now friendly, and that no difficulty would be met with on the way. Another reason for his choosing that route was that he might determine whether on his next venture it would not be more advantageous to bring down his merchandise by ship and start from the seashore for Meroe. "Undoubtedly it would be better," the governor said; "but it were wiser to sail another 2 days' journey down the coast, and then to journey by way of Axum." A week's rest completely recruited the strength of the girls, and Jethro then engaged a passage in a trading ship which was going to touch at various small ports on its way north. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G.A. Henty. Chapter 18. The Desert Journey. The journey was a long one. The winds were often so light that the vessels scarcely moved, and the heat was greater than anything they had felt during their journey. They stopped at many small ports on the Arabian side, the captain trading with the natives, selling to them articles of Egyptian manufacture, and buying the products of the country for sale in Egypt. The party had, before starting, arranged that they would land at Ilana, a town lying at the head of the gulf of the same name, forming the eastern arm of the Red Sea. By so doing, they would avoid the passage through Lower Egypt. The question had not been decided without long debate. By crossing from Arsinoe to Pelusium, they would at the latter port be able to obtain a passage in a Phoenician trader to a port in the north of Syria, and there strike across Asia Minor for the Caspian. Jethro was in favor of this route, because it would save the girls the long and arduous journey up through Syria. They, however, made light of this, and declared their readiness to undergo any hardships rather than to run the risk of the whole party being discovered either upon landing at Arsinoe or on their journey north, when they would pass through the very country that Amuba and Chebron had visited, and that was inhabited by Ruth's people. All allowed that the time had long since passed when the authorities would be keeping up a special watch for them, but as upon entering port a scribe would come on board and make a list of the passengers with their place of birth and vocation, for registration in the official records, it would be difficult in the extreme to give such answers as would avoid exciting suspicion. When the vessel reached the mouth of the long and narrow gulf the party were struck by the grandeur of the mountains that rose from the water's edge on their left. The captain told them that the chief of these was known as Mount Sinai, and that barren and desolate as the land looked, it contained valleys where sheep were pastured and where wandering tribes found a subsistence. No hint had been given to the captain that they had any intention of cutting short their voyage before arriving at Arsinoe, for it would have seemed an extraordinary proceeding for a trader journeying with his family to leave the ship at any of the Arabian ports. While sailing up the gulf Mysa complained of illness, and indeed so overpowered was she by the heat that there was but little fiction in the complaint. Upon arriving at Ælana Jethro had her carried on shore, and, hiring a house there, stayed on shore while the ship was in port. There was a small Egyptian garrison in the town, which carried on a considerable trade with Moab and the country to the east. No attention, however, was paid to the landing of the traders, for, as the country beyond the walls of the town lay beyond the limit of Egyptian rule, the landing and departure of persons at the port was a matter of no interest to the authorities. 2 days later Jethro went on board again and said that his young son was so ill that there was no chance of him being able to proceed on the journey, and that therefore he must forfeit the passage money paid to Arsinoe. He said that as it might be many weeks before another vessel would come along, he should endeavor to pay his way by trading with the natives, and he therefore wished to purchase from him a portion of his remaining goods suitable for the purpose. As the captain saw that he would save the provisions for 5 persons for the month or 6 weeks that the voyage would yet last, and at the same time get rid of some of his surplus cargo, he assented without question to Jethro's proposal. Several bales of goods were made up, consisting principally of cloths of various texture and color of Egyptian manufacture, trinkets, and a selection of arms. These were landed, and 2 days later the vessel set sail. Jethro called upon the Egyptian commandant, and by making him a handsome present at once enlisted his aid in his enterprise. He said that as he had been detained by the illness of his son, and it might be a long time before any vessel came, he thought of getting rid of the rest of the merchandise he had brought with him by trade with the people of Moab. "That you can do if you reach Moab," the Egyptian said, "for traders are everywhere well received; but the journey from here is not without dangers. It is a country without a master. The people have no fixed abodes, moving here and there according as they can find food for their animals, sometimes among the valleys of Sinai, sometimes in the desert to the east. These people plunder any whom they may come across, and not content with plunder might slay or carry you away as slaves. Once you have passed through as far as Moab you are safe, as you would also be if you journeyed to the west of the Salt Lake, into which runs the river Jordan. There are many tribes there, all living in cities, warlike and valorous people, among whom also you would be safe. We have had many wars with them, and not always to our advantage. But between us is a sort of truce. They do not molest our armies marching along by the seacoast, nor do we go up among their hills to meddle with them. These are the people who at one time conquered a portion of Lower Egypt, and reigned over it for many generations until, happily, we rose and drove them out."
"Is the journey between this and the Salt Lake you speak of an arduous one?"
"It is by no means difficult, except that it were best to carry water upon the journey, for the wells are few and often dry; but the country is flat for the whole distance. Indeed, there is a tradition that this gulf at one time extended as far north as the Salt Lake. The road, therefore, though stony and rough, offers no difficulties whatever; but I should advise you, if you determine upon the journey, to leave your son behind."
"It is better for him to travel than to remain here without me," Jethro said. "And if we go up through the people you speak of to the west of this lake and river, it would be but a short journey for us after disposing of our goods to make our way down to a port on the Great Sea, whence we may take ship and return quickly to Pelusium, and thus arrive home before we should find a ship to take us hence."
"That is so," the Egyptian said. "The winds are so uncertain on these seas that, as far as time goes, you might journey by the route you propose and reach Egypt more speedily than you would do if you went on board a ship at once. The danger lies almost entirely in the first portion of your journey. The caravans that go hence once or twice a year through Moab to Palmyra are numerous and well armed, and capable of resisting an attack by these robber tribesmen. But one left a few weeks ago, and it may be some months before another starts."
"What animals would you recommend me to take with me?" Beyond all doubt camels are the best. They are used but little in this country, but come down sometimes with the caravans from Palmyra, and I believe that there is at present in the town an Arab who possesses 6 or 7 of them. He came down with the last caravan, but was taken ill and unable to return with it. Doubtless you could make a bargain with him. I will send a soldier with you to the house he occupies."
Jethro found that the man was anxious to return to his own country, which lay on the borders of Media, and therefore directly in the direction which Jethro wished to travel. He was, however, unwilling to undertake the journey except with a caravan, having intended to wait for the next however long the time might be; but the sum that Jethro offered him for the hire of his animals as far as Palmyra at last induced him to consent to make the journey at once, bargaining, however, that a party of 10 armed men should be hired as an escort as far as the borders of Moab. Highly pleased with the result of his inquiries, Jethro returned home and told his companions the arrangements he had made.
"I have only arranged for our journey as far as Palmyra," he said, "as it would have raised suspicion had I engaged him for the whole journey to Media; but of course he will gladly continue the arrangement for the whole journey. He has bargained for an escort of 10 men, but we will take 20. There is ample store of your father's gold still unexhausted, and indeed we have spent but little yet, for the sale of our goods when we left the boat paid all our expenses of the journey up the Nile. Therefore, as this seems to be the most hazardous part of our journey, we will not stint money in performing it in safety. I have told him that we shall start in a week's time. It would not do to leave earlier. You must not recover too rapidly from your illness. In the meantime I will make it my business to pick out a score of good fighting men as our escort."
In this the Egyptian captain was of use, recommending men whose families resided in Ælana, and would therefore be hostages for their fidelity. This was necessary, for no small portion of the men to be met with in the little town were native tribesmen who had encamped at a short distance from its walls, and had come in to trade in horses or the wool of their flocks for the cloths of Egypt. Such men as these would have been a source of danger rather than of protection. By the end of the week he had collected a party of 20 men, all of whom were to provide their own horses. The sum agreed upon for their escort was to be paid into the hands of the Egyptian officer, who was to hand it to them on their return, with a document signed by Jethro to the effect that they had faithfully carried out the terms of their agreement. Jethro found that the expense of the escort was less than he had anticipated, for when the men found that the party would be a strong one, therefore capable of protecting itself both on the journey out and on its return, they demanded but a moderate sum for their services. When the owner of the camels learned that they had decided positively to pass to the east of the Salt Lake, he advised them strongly, instead of following the valley of Ælana to the Salt Lake, where it would be difficult to obtain water, to take the road to the east of the range of hills skirting the valleys, and so to proceed through Petra and Shobek and Karik to Hesbon in Moab. This was the route followed by all the caravans. Villages would be found at very short distances, and there was no difficulty whatever about water. "My camels," he said, "can go long distances without water, and could take the valley route, but the horses would suffer greatly." Jethro was glad to hear that the journey was likely to be less toilsome than he had anticipated, and all the arrangements having been concluded, the party started soon after dawn on the day at first fixed upon. The girls were still in male attire, and rode in large baskets, slung one on each side of a camel. The camel driver walked at the head of the animal, leading it by a cord. Its fellows followed in a long line, each fastened to the one before it. Jethro, Amuba, and Chebron, all armed with bows and arrows, as well as swords, rode beside the girl's camel. Half the escort went on ahead, the other half formed the rear guard.
"Which is the most dangerous part of the journey?" Jethro asked the camel driver. "That on which we are now entering," he replied. "Once we arrive at Petra we are comparatively safe, but this portion of the journey passes over a rough and uninhabited country, and it is across this line that the wandering tribesmen pass in their journeys to or from the pastures round Mount Sinai. The steep hills on our left form at once a hiding place and a lookout. There they can watch for travelers passing along this road, and swoop down upon them." "How long shall we be reaching Petra?" "It is 3 days' fair traveling; but as the beasts are fresh, by journeying well on to sundown we could accomplish it in 2 days. After that we can travel at our ease; the villages lie but a few miles apart." "Let us push on then by all means," said Jethro. "We can stay a day at Petra to rest the beasts, but let us get through this desolate and dangerous country as soon as we can."
The girls had been greatly amused at first by the appearance of the strange animal that was carrying them, but they soon found that the swinging action was extremely fatiguing, and they would have gladly got down and walked. Jethro, however, said that this could not be, for the pace of the animal, deliberate though it seemed, was yet too great for them to keep up with on foot, and it was needful for the first 2 days to push on at full speed. The sun blazed with tremendous force, and was reflected from the black rock of the hills and the white sand lying between the stones that everywhere strewed the plain along which they were traveling, and the heat was terrible. After traveling for 3 hours they halted for an hour, and Jethro managed, with the poles that had been brought to form the framework of tents, and some cloths, to fasten an awning over the baskets in which the girls were riding. The camels had lain down as soon as they halted, and the girls stepped into the baskets before they arose. They gave a simultaneous cry as the animal rose. They had prepared for him to rise on his forelegs, and when his hind quarter suddenly rose in the air, they were almost thrown from their baskets. "I don't like this creature a bit," Mysa said as they moved on. "Who would suppose that he was going to get up the wrong way first? Besides, why does he keep on grumbling? I am sure that Ruth and I cannot be such a very heavy load for such a great beast. I believe he would have bit us as we got in if the driver had not jerked the rope at its head. It must be much nicer to sit on a horse. I am sure that looks easy enough." "It is not so easy as it looks, Mysa," Chebron replied. "Besides, you know women never do ride horses." "They do in our country," Amuba said. "When we get there, Mysa, I will teach you how to sit on them." "Ah, it is a long way off, Amuba," Mysa replied, "and I believe this creature has made up his mind to shake us to pieces as soon as he can."
"You should not try to sit stiff," Jethro said. "Sit quite easily, and sway backward and forward with the motion of the basket. You will soon get accustomed to it, and will find that ere long you will be able to sleep as if in a cradle." They traveled on until the sun was just sinking, and then prepared to camp for the night. They had brought with them several skins of water, and from these a scanty drink was given to each of the horses. A few handfuls of grain were also served out to each. The drivers stuck their spears firmly into the ground and to these fastened them. The camels were made to kneel down so as to form a square. In the center of this the tent was pitched for the girls, the horses being arranged in a circle outside. The men had all brought with them flat cakes, and with these and a handful of dates they made their meal, and there was no occasion for lighting a fire, for Jethro's party had brought an ample store of cooked provisions for their own use. In a short time quiet reigned in the camp. The journey had been a hot and fatiguing one, and the men wrapping themselves in their cloaks lay down, each by his spear, and were soon asleep, with the exception of 4 who took their posts as sentries. Jethro had agreed with Amuba and Chebron that they also would divide the night between them, taking it by turns to keep watch. The men of the escort were, however, of opinion that there was very little probability of any attack before morning, even had they been watched by a party among the hills. "They could hardly hope to take us by surprise, for they would be sure that we should set a watch in the darkness. They could not make their way down the hills without some noise. Besides, they believe that the powers of evil are potent at night, and seldom stir out of their camps after dark. If we are attacked at all, it is likely to be just before sunrise." Jethro had therefore arranged that Chebron should keep the first watch, Amuba the second, and that he himself would take charge 4 hours before daylight. The night passed without any cause for alarm. As soon as daylight broke the camp was astir. Another ration of water and grain was served out to the horses, a hasty meal was made by the men, and just as the sun rose the cavalcade moved on. They had journeyed but half a mile, when from behind a spur of the hills running out in the plain a large party was seen to issue forth. There must have been fully 100 of them, of whom some 20 were mounted and the rest on foot. The travelers halted and had a short consultation. Jethro with one of the escort then rode out to meet the advancing party, waving a white cloth in token of amity. 2 of the Arabs rode forward to meet them. It was some time before Jethro returned to the party, who were anxiously awaiting the termination of the colloquy. "What do they say, Jethro?" Amuba asked as he rode up. "He says, to begin with, that we ought to have purchased from him the right of traveling across the country. I said that I would gladly have paid a moderate sum had I been aware that such was required, but that as he was not in Ælana I could not tell that he claimed such a right. At the same time I was ready to make an offer of 4 rolls of Egyptian cloth. He rejected the offer with scorn, and after a long conversation let me know pretty plainly that he intended to take all our goods and animals, and that we might think ourselves fortunate in being allowed to pursue our way on foot. I said that I would consult my friends, that if they agreed to his terms we would keep the white flag flying, if we refused them we would lower it."
"Then you may as well lower it at once, Jethro," Amuba said. "We might as well be killed at once as be plundered of all we possess by these Arab rascals. Besides, as there are 23 of us, and all well armed, we ought to be able to cut our way through them. At the worst the girls could mount behind us, and we could make a circuit so as to avoid the footmen, and if the horsemen ventured to attack us we could soon give a good account of them."
"Yes, but we should lose our 7 camel loads of goods, and we shall want them for trade as we go along," Jethro said. "I propose that we should form the camels into a square, as we did last night, that you 2 and 6 of the men armed with bows and arrows shall occupy it and take care of the girls, while the rest of us charge the Arabs. If we can defeat the horsemen it is probable that the men on foot will draw off. But while we are doing so some of those on foot may rush forward and attack you. We will take care not to pursue, and you can rely upon our coming to your assistance as soon as you are attacked."
"I think that is the best plan, Jethro. We can keep them off for some time with our bows and arrows, for certainly Chebron and I can bring down a man with each shot at 100 yards." Jethro chose 6 of the men who professed themselves to be good archers. Their horses' legs were tied and the animals thrown down just outside the square formed by the kneeling camels. Strict instructions were given to the girls to lie down, and the saddles and bales were arranged outside the camels to shield them from missiles. Then when all was prepared the white flag was lowered, and Jethro with his 14 men rode at full gallop against the Arabs. Trusting to their somewhat superior numbers the Arab horsemen advanced to meet them, but Jethro's party, obeying his orders to keep in a close line together with their spears leveled in front of them, rode right over the Arabs, who came up singly and without order. Men and horses rolled over together, several of the former transfixed by the spears of the horsemen. Jethro called upon his men to halt and turned upon the Arabs. Some of the latter fled toward the footmen, who were running up to their assistance, but were pursued and cut down. Others fought to the last silently and desperately, but these too were slain. As soon as the footmen approached they opened fire with slings and stones. Jethro rallied his men and formed them in line again, and at their head charged the Arabs. The latter fought steadily. Giving way for a moment, they closed in round the little party of horsemen, throwing their javelins and hacking at them with their swords. Jethro spurred his horse into their midst, dealing blows right and left with his heavy axe. His followers pressed after him, and after hard fighting cut their way through their opponents. Again and again the maneuver was repeated, the resistance of the Arabs weakening, as most of their best men had fallen, while the large shields carried by the horsemen repelled the greater part of the missiles they hurled at them. Another minute or two and the Arabs broke and fled from the hills, leaving over 20 of their number on the ground, in addition to the whole of their mounted men. Jethro had now time to look round, and saw for the first time that he had not, as he supposed, been engaged with the whole of the enemy's party. While some 50 of them had attacked him, the rest had made direct for the camels, and were now gathered in a mass around them. With a shout to his men to follow him Jethro galloped at full speed toward the Arabs, and with a shout flung himself upon them, clearing his way through them with his axe. He was but just in time. A desperate conflict was raging across the camels. At one point several of the Arabs had broken into the square, and these were opposed by Amuba, Chebron, and one of the men, while the others still held back the Arabs on the other side. The arrival of Jethro, followed closely by the rest of his men, instantly put a stop to the conflict. The Arabs no longer thought of attacking, but with cries of dismay started for the hills, hotly pursued by the horsemen, who followed them until they reached the foot of the rocks. As soon as the Arabs gained their fastnesses they again betook themselves to their slings, and the horsemen fell back to the camels. Jethro had not joined in the pursuit, but as soon as the Arabs fled had leaped from his horse. "You were almost too late, Jethro," Amuba said.
"I was indeed," Jethro replied. "I thought that I was engaged with the whole of the footmen, and in the heat of the fight did not notice that a party had moved off to attack you. You are terribly hurt, I fear, both you and Chebron. Are both the girls unharmed?"
Mysa and Ruth had both risen to their feet as soon as the attack ceased. "We are both safe," Mysa replied; "but oh, how terribly you are hurt, both of you, and Jethro too is wounded."
"My wound is nothing," Jethro said. "Let us look to those of Chebron first,"
for Chebron had sat down against one of the camels. "Do not be alarmed," Chebron said faintly. "I think it is only loss of blood. My shield covered my body."
"Now, girls," Jethro said, "do you get beyond the camels, open one of the bales of cloth, and set to work tearing it up in strips for bandages. I will look after these two." After an examination of their wounds Jethro was able to say that he did not think that any of them would have very serious consequences. Both had been wounded in the leg with javelins, the side of Chebron's face was laid open by a sword cut, and a spear had cut through the flesh and grazed the ribs on the right side. Amuba's most serious wound had been inflicted by a javelin thrown at him sideways. This had passed completely through his back under both shoulder blades and had broken off there. Jethro cut off the ragged end, and taking hold of the point protruding behind the left arm, drew the shaft through. Then taking some of the bandages from the girls, he bound up all the wounds, and then proceeded to examine those of the men who were already occupied in stanching the flow of blood from their comrades' wounds. It was found that one of the defenders of the square was dead and 3 others severely wounded. Of Jethro's party 2 had fallen and all had received wounds more or less severe. Had it not been for the shields that covered their bodies few would have emerged alive from the conflict, but these gave them an immense advantage over the Arabs, who carried no such means of protection. The owner of the camels had escaped unhurt, having remained during the fight hidden under some bales. As soon as the wounds were all bandaged and a drink of wine and water had been served out to each, the camels were unbound and permitted to rise. 3 of the men most seriously wounded, being unable to sit on their horses, were placed on the bales carried by camels, and the party again set out. It was well that they were obliged to proceed at the pace of the camels, for several men could scarcely sit their horses, and could not have done so at a pace exceeding a walk. "Now, Amuba, let us hear about your fight," Jethro said. "I have not had time to ask a question yet."
"There is naught to tell," Amuba said. "We saw you charge down upon their horsemen and destroy them, and then ride into the middle of their foot. At once a party of about 30 strong detached themselves and made straight for us. As soon as they came within range of our arrows we began. I shot 4 before they reached us, and I think Chebron did the same; but the men with us shot but poorly, and I do not think that they can have killed more than 7 or 8 between them. However, altogether that accounted for about half their number, and there were only about 15 who got up to a hand-to-hand fight with us. For a bit, aided by our breastwork, we kept them out, but at last they managed to spring over, and although we were doing our best and several of them had fallen, we had been wounded, and it would have gone very hard with us in another minute or 2 if you had not come up to the rescue. Now let us hear what you were doing." Jethro then described the encounter he and his party had had with the footmen.
"They fight well, these Arabs," he said, "and it was well for us that we all carried shields, for had we not done so they would have riddled us with their javelins. As you see, I had a narrow escape, for had that dart that went through my ear been an inch or 2 to the right it would have pierced my eye. I have 2 or 3 nasty gashes with their swords on the legs, and I think that most of the other men came out worse than I did. It was lucky that they did not strike at the horses, but I suppose they wanted them, and so avoided inflicting injury on them. However, it has been a tough fight, and we are well out of it. I hope I shall not be called on to use my battle axe again until I am fighting in the ranks of the Rebu."
End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G.A. Henty. Chapter 19. Home at Last. When they neared Petra, a horn was heard to blow, and people were seen running about among the houses. "They take us for a party of Arabs," one of the horsemen said.
As I have often been through the town and am known to several persons here, I will, if you like, hurry on and tell them that we are peaceful travelers." The party halted for a few minutes and then moved slowly forward again. By the time they reached the town the news that the party were traders had spread, and the people were issuing from their houses. These were small and solidly built of stone. They were but 1 story high. The roof was flat, with a low wall running round it, and the houses had but 1 door, opening externally. This was very low and narrow, so that those inside could offer a determined resistance against entry. As the town stood on the slope of the hill, and the roofs of the lower houses were commanded by those from above, the place was capable of offering a determined resistance against marauding tribes. The head man of the place met the travelers and conducted them to an empty house, which he placed at their disposal, and offered a present of fowls, dates, and wine. The news that a heavy defeat had been inflicted upon one of the wandering bands excited satisfaction, for the interference of these plunderers greatly affected the prosperity of the place, as the inhabitants were unable to trade with Ælana unless going down in very strong parties. Every attention was paid to the party by the inhabitants. Their wounds were bathed and oil poured into them, and in the more serious cases boiled herbs of medicinal virtue were applied as poultices to the wounds. Petra at that time was but a large village, but it afterward rose into a place of importance. The travelers remained here for a week, at the end of which time all save 2 were in a fit state to continue their journey. Without further adventure the journey was continued to Moab. On their arrival here the escort was dismissed, each man receiving a present in addition to the stipulated rate of pay that they were to draw upon their return to Ælana. Moab was a settled country. It contained no large towns, but the population, which was considerable, was gathered in small villages of low stone-built houses similar to those in Petra. The inhabitants were ready to trade. Their language was strange to Jethro and Amuba, but it was closely related to that spoken by Ruth, and she generally acted as interpreter between Jethro and the natives. After traveling through Moab, they took the caravan road across the desert to the northeast, passed through the oasis of Palmyra, a large and flourishing city, and then journeyed on the Euphrates. They were now in the country of the Assyrians, and not wishing to attract attention or questions, they avoided Nineveh and the other great cities, and kept on their way north until they reached the mountainous country lying between Assyria and the Caspian. They met with many delays upon the way, and it was 6 months after leaving Ælana before, after passing through a portion of Persia, they reached the country inhabited by the scattered tribes known by the general name of Medes, and to whom the Rebu were related. Through this country Thotmes had carried his arms, and most of the tribes acknowledged the dominion of Egypt, and paid a tribute to that country, Egyptian garrisons being scattered here and there among them. Jethro and Amuba now felt at home, but as they determined that when they reached their own country they would, until they found how matters were going on there, disguise their identity, they now traveled as Persian traders. Long before reaching Persia they had disposed of the stock of goods with which they started, and had now supplied themselves with articles of Persian manufacture. They thus passed on unquestioned from village to village, as the trade in those regions was entirely carried on by Persian merchants, that country having already attained a comparatively high amount of civilization, while the Median tribes, although settled down into fixed communities, had as yet but little knowledge of the arts of peace. The party journeyed in company with some Persian traders, and gradually worked their way north until they arrived at the first Rebu village. They had many times debated the question of the part they should here play, and had agreed that it would be better to continue to maintain their character as Persian traders until they had learned the exact position of affairs. In order to be able to keep up their disguise they had laid in a fresh stock of Persian goods at the last large town through which they passed. Had Jethro been alone he could at once have declared himself, and would have been received with joy as one who had made his way back from captivity in Egypt. But for Amuba there would have been danger in his being recognized until the disposition of the occupant of the throne was discovered. There would, indeed, have been small chance of his being recognized had he been alone. Nearly 4 years had elapsed since he had been carried away captive, and he had grown from a boy into a powerful young man.
but had Jethro been recognized his companion's identity might have been suspected, as he was known to have been the special mentor and companion of the young prince. As to Amuba, he had no desire whatever to occupy the throne of the Rebu, and desired only to reside quietly in his native country. The large sum that Ameres had handed over to the care of Jethro had been much diminished by the expenses of their long journey, but there was still ample to ensure for them all a good position in a country where money was not abundant. In their journey through Persia they had picked up many of the words of that language differing from those of the Rebu, and using these in their conversation they were able to pass well as traders who in their previous journeys in the land had acquired a fair knowledge of the dialect of the people. They soon learned that an Egyptian garrison still occupied the capital, that the people groaned under the exactions necessary to pay the annual tribute, and that General Amusis, who had, as Amuba's father expected he would do, seized the throne of the Rebu after the departure of the main Egyptian army, was in close intimacy with the Egyptian officials, and was in consequence extremely unpopular among the people. He had, on his accession to power, put to death all the relatives of the late king who could be considered as rival claimants for the throne, and there could be little doubt that did he suspect that Amuba had returned from Egypt, he would not hesitate to remove him from his path. Amuba had several long consultations with Jethro as to his course. He repeated to him the conversation that he had had with his father on the day previous to the battle in which the latter was slain, how he had warned him against the ambition of Amusis, and advised him, rather than risk the chances of civil war in endeavoring to assert his rights, to collect a body of adherents and to seek a new home in the far west. Jethro, however, was strongly of opinion that the advice, although excellent at the time, was no longer appropriate.
To begin with, Amuba, you were then but a boy of 16, and engaged as we were in war with Egypt, the people would naturally have preferred having a well-known and skillful general at their head to a boy whom they could not hope would lead them successfully in war. You are now a man. You have had a wide experience. You have an acquaintance with the manners and ways of our conquerors, and were you on the throne could do much for the people, and could promote their welfare by encouraging new methods of agriculture, and teaching them something of the civilization in Egypt. In the second place, in the 4 years that have elapsed, Amusis has had time to make himself unpopular. The necessity for heavy taxation to raise the annual tribute has naturally told against him, to say nothing of the fact that he is said to be on friendly terms with our foreign oppressors. Therefore the chances would be all in your favor."
"But I have no desire to be king," Amuba replied. "I want to live in quiet contentment."
"You are born to be king, Prince Amuba," Jethro said. "It is not a matter of your choice. Besides, it is evident that for the good of the people it is necessary that the present usurper should be overthrown and the lawful dynasty restored. Besides this, it is clear that you cannot live in peace and contentment as you say. You might at any moment be recognized and your life forfeited. As to the original plan, I am sure that your father would not have advocated it under the changed circumstances. Besides, I think you have had your fair share of wandering and dangers. Moreover, I suppose you would hardly wish to drag Mysa with you on your journey to an unknown country, where all sorts of trials and struggles must unquestionably be encountered before you succeed in founding a new settlement. I suppose," he said with a smile, "you would not propose leaving her here to whatever fate might befall her. I fancy from what I have seen during the last 6 months that you have altogether other intentions concerning her."
Amuba was silent for some time. "But if Amusis is supported by the Egyptians," he said at last, "and is viewed by them as their ally, I should not be able to overthrow him without becoming involved in hostilities with them also. It is not," he went on, seeing that Jethro was about to speak, "of the garrison here that I am thinking, but of the power of Egypt behind it. Did I overthrow Amusis and defeat the Egyptians, his friends, I should bring upon my country a fresh war with Egypt."
"Egypt is, as we have found, a very long way off, Amuba. Occasionally a warlike monarch arises under whom her arms are carried vast distances, and many nations are brought under her sway. But such efforts are made but rarely, and we lie at the extremest limit of her power. Thotmes himself has gained sufficient glory. He was absent for years from his country, and at the end of long journeyings returned home to enjoy the fruits of his victories. It is not likely that he would again start on so long an expedition merely to bring so distant a corner of the land subject to Egypt again under her sway. The land is stripped of its wealth. There is nothing to reward such vast toil and the outlay that would be required to carry out such an expedition, and it may be generations before another monarch may arise thirsting like Thotmes for glory, and willing to leave the luxuries of Egypt for a course of distant conquest. Besides, Egypt has already learned to her cost that the Rebu are not to be overcome bloodlessly, and that defeat is just as likely as victory to attend her arms against us. Therefore, I do not think that the thought of the vengeance of Egypt need deter you. In other respects, the present occupation by them is in your favor, rather than otherwise, for you will appear before the people not only as their rightful king, but as their liberator from the hated Egyptian yoke." "You are right, Jethro," Amuba said after a long silence. "It is my duty to assert my rights and to restore the land to freedom. My mind is made up now. What is your advice in the matter?" "I should journey through the land until we reach a port by the sea frequented by Persian traders, and should there leave the two girls in charge of the family of some trader in the country. There they can remain in tranquility until matters are settled. Chebron will, I am sure, insist upon sharing our fortunes. Our long wanderings have made a man of him, too. They have not only strengthened his frame and hardened his constitution, but they have given stability to his character. He is thoughtful and prudent, and his advice will always be valuable, while of his courage I have no more doubt than I have of yours. When you have once gained your kingdom you will find in Chebron a wise counselor, one on whom you can lean in all times of difficulty. When we have left the girls behind we will continue our journey through the land, and gradually put ourselves into communication with such governors of towns and other persons of influence as we may learn to be discontented with the present state of things, so that when we strike our blow the whole country will declare for you at once. As we travel we will gradually collect a body of determined men for the surprise of the capital. There must be numbers of my old friends and comrades still surviving, and there should be no difficulty in collecting a force capable of capturing the city by a surprise." Jethro's plans were carried out, and the girls placed under the care of the wife of a Persian trader in a seaport close to the frontier of Persia. The others then started upon their journey, still traveling as Persians. Jethro had little difficulty in discovering the sentiments of the principal men in the towns through which they passed. Introducing himself first to them as a Persian trader desirous of their protection in traveling through the country, he soon disclosed to them his own individuality. To many of them he was known either personally or by repute. He informed them that he had escaped from Egypt with Amuba, but he led them to believe that his companion was waiting in Persian territory until he learned from him that the country was ripe for his appearance, for he thought it best in no case to disclose the fact that Amuba was with him, lest some of those with whom he communicated should endeavor to gain rewards from the king by betraying him. His tidings were everywhere received with joy, and in many cases Jethro was urged to send at once for Amuba and to show him to the people, for that all the land would instantly rise on his behalf. Jethro, however, declared that Amuba would bide his time, for that a premature disclosure would enable the king to call together a portion of the army which had formerly fought under his orders, and that with the assistance of the Egyptians he might be able to form a successful resistance to a popular rising. "I intend," he said, "if possible, to collect a small force to seize the person of the usurper by surprise, and so paralyze resistance; in which case there would only be the Egyptians to deal with, and these would be starved out of their fortress long before assistance could reach them." After visiting most of the towns Jethro and his companions journeyed through the villages remote from the capital. Here the king's authority was lightly felt save when the troops arrived once a year to gather in the taxes. Less caution was therefore necessary, and Jethro soon made himself known and began to enlist men to the service. This he had no difficulty in doing. The news that an attempt was at once to be made to overthrow the usurper and to free the land of the Egyptians, and that at the proper time the rightful king would present himself and take the command, was received with enthusiasm.
In each valley through which they passed the whole of the young men enrolled themselves, receiving orders to remain perfectly quiet, and to busy themselves in fabricating arms, of which the land had been stripped by the Egyptians, until a messenger arrived summoning them to meet at a rendezvous on an appointed day. In 6 weeks the number of the enrolled had reached the point that was considered necessary for the enterprise, and a day was fixed on which they were to assemble among the hills a few miles distant from the town. Upon the appointed day the bands began to arrive. Jethro had purchased cattle and provisions, and receiving each band as it arrived formed them into companies and appointed their leaders. Great fires were lighted and the cattle slaughtered. Chebron aided in the arrangements, but Amuba, by Jethro's advice, passed the day in a small tent that had been pitched in the center of the camp. By the evening the whole of the contingents had arrived, and Jethro saw with satisfaction the spirit that animated them all, and the useful if somewhat rough weapons that they had fashioned. When all had assembled he drew them up in a body, and after a speech that excited their patriotic feelings to the utmost, he went to the tent, and leading Amuba forth presented him to them as their king. He had in his journeys through the towns procured from some of the principal men arms and armor fitted for persons of high rank, which had been lying concealed since the conquest by the Egyptians. Amuba was accoutred in these, and as he appeared at the door of his tent a wild shout of greeting burst from the troops, and breaking their ranks they rushed forward, and throwing themselves on their faces round him, hailed him as their king and promised to follow him to the death. It was a long time before the enthusiasm and excitement abated. Then Amuba addressed his followers, promising them deliverance from the Egyptian yoke and from the taxation under which they so long groaned. A week was spent in establishing order and discipline in the gathering, sentries being placed at a distance round the camp to prevent any stranger entering, or anyone leaving to carry the news to the city. In the meantime trusted men were sent to the town to ascertain the exact position of affairs there, and to learn whether the garrison had been placed on their guard by any rumors that might have reached the town of disaffection in the country districts. They returned with the intelligence that although reports had been received that the late king's son had escaped captivity in Egypt and would shortly appear to claim his rights, the news had been received with absolute incredulity, the king and his Egyptian allies scoffing at the idea of a captive making his escape from Egypt and traversing the long intervening distance. So complete had been the quiet throughout the country since the Egyptian occupation that the garrison had ceased to take any precautions whatever. No watch was set, and the gates of the city were seldom closed even at night. The plans were now finally arranged. Jethro, with a band of 200 men, was to enter the town in the daytime, some going down to the next port and arriving by sea, others entering singly through the gates. At midnight they were to assemble in the square round the palace, which was to be suddenly attacked. Amuba, with the main body, was to approach the city late in the evening and to station themselves near one of the gates. Jethro was before the hour named for the attack to see whether this gate was open and unguarded, and if he found that it was closed and under charge of an Egyptian guard, he was to tell off 50 men of his command to attack and overpower the Egyptians, and throw open the gate the instant they heard the trumpet, which was to be the signal for the attack of the palace. Jethro's party were, therefore, the first to start, going off in little groups, some to the neighboring ports, others direct to the city. Jethro himself was the last to set out, having himself given instructions to each group as they started as to their behavior and entry into the city, and the rendezvous at which they were to assemble. He also arranged that if at any time they should hear his call upon the horn, which was to be repeated by 3 or 4 of his followers, who were provided with similar instruments, they were to hurry to the spot at the top of their speed.
"One can never tell," he said when he told Amuba the orders he had given, "what may happen. I believe that every man here is devoted to you, but there may always be one traitor in a crowd. But even without that, some careless speech on the part of one of them, a quarrel with one of the king's men or with an Egyptian, and the number of armed men in the city might be discovered. For others would run up to help their comrade, and the broil would grow until all were involved. Other reasons might render it advisable to strike at an earlier hour than I arranged."
"I cannot think so," Amuba replied. "I should say if anything were to precipitate affairs it would be most prejudicial. You, with your small force, would be certain to be overwhelmed by the large body of followers whom, as we have learned, the king keeps in his palace, to say nothing of the Egyptians. In that case not only would you lose your lives, but you would put them so thoroughly upon their guard that our enterprise at night would have little chance of success."
"That is true," Jethro said, "and I certainly do not mean to make the slightest variation from the plan we agreed upon, unless I am driven to it. Still it is as well to be prepared for everything."
"Of course I know that you will do nothing that is rash, Jethro. After being all these years my guide and counselor, I know that you would do nothing to endanger our success now that it seemed almost assured." Jethro had in fact a reason for wishing to be able to collect his men suddenly which he had not mentioned to Amuba. He thought it possible that, as he had said, at the last moment the plot might by some means or other be discovered; and his idea was that if that were the case he would instantly gather his followers and attack the palace, trusting to surprise and to his knowledge of the building in the endeavor to fight his way to the king's abode and slay him there, even if he himself and his men were afterward surrounded and cut to pieces. The usurper once removed, Jethro had no doubt that the whole nation would gladly acknowledge Amuba, who would then have only the Egyptian garrison to deal with. No such accident, however, happened. The men entered the town unnoticed. Those who had come by boat, and who were for the most part natives of villages along the shore, remained in the lower town near the landing place. Such of them as had friends went to their houses. Those who entered the gates sauntered about the town singly or in pairs, and as their weapons were hidden they attracted no notice, having the appearance of men who had come in from the country round to dispose of their produce or the spoils of the chase, or to exchange them for such articles as were required at home. Jethro went at once to the house of an old friend with whom he had already communicated by messenger. The house was situated on the open space facing the palace. Here from time to time he received messages from his sub leaders, and learned that all was going on well. He heard that the continual rumors from the country of the approaching return of the son of the late king had at last caused some anxiety to the usurper, who had that morning seized and thrown into prison several leading men who were known to be personally attached to the late king. Not, indeed, that he believed that Amuba could have returned, but he thought it possible that some impostor might be trading on his name. Several bodies of men had been dispatched from the town to the places whence these rumors had been received, to ascertain what truth there was in them, and to suppress at once any signs of revolt against the king's authority. This was highly satisfactory news to Jethro, as in the first place it showed that the king did not dream of danger in his capital, and in the second place it reduced the number of fighting men in the palace to a number but slightly exceeding the force at his own disposal. Jethro did not stir abroad until nightfall, his face being so well known in the town that he might at any moment be recognized. But as soon as it was dark he went out, and accompanied by his friend went round the town. He found that some changes had taken place since he had last been there. The Egyptians had entirely cleared away the huts toward the end of the rock furthest from the sea, and had there erected large buildings for the use of the governor, officers, and troops, and had run a wall across from the walls on either side, entirely separating their quarter from the rest of the town. Jethro's friend informed him that the erection of these buildings had greatly added to the hatred with which the Egyptians were regarded, as they had been erected with forced labor, the people being driven in by thousands and compelled to work for many months at the buildings. Jethro learned that as soon as the inner wall was completed the Egyptians had ceased altogether to keep watch at the gates of the city walls, but that they had for a long time kept a vigilant guard at the gate leading to their quarters through the new wall. For the last year, however, owing to the absence of any spirit of revolt among the Rebu, and to their confidence in the friendship of the king, they had greatly relaxed their vigilance. By 9 o'clock all was quiet in the town. Jethro sent out a messenger by the road by which Amuba's force would approach, to tell him that the city walls were all unguarded, and that he had better enter by the gate half an hour before midnight, instead of waiting until he heard the signal for attack. He could then move his men up close to the Egyptian wall so as to attack that gate when the signal was given, otherwise the Egyptians would be put on their guard by the sound of fighting at the palace before he could arrive at their gate. At the time he had named, Jethro went to the gate by which Amuba was to enter, and soon heard a faint confused noise, and a minute or two later a dark mass of men were at the path at the gate. They were headed by Amuba. Jethro at once explained to him the exact position, and his companion placed himself by the side of Amuba to act as his guide to the Egyptian wall. Jethro then returned to the rendezvous, where his men were already drawn up in order. Midnight was now close at hand. Quietly the band crossed the square to the gate of the palace, then Jethro gave a loud blast of his horn, and in an instant a party of men armed with heavy axes rushed forward and began to hew down the gate. As the thundering noise rose on the night air cries of terror and the shouts of officers were heard within the royal enclosure. Then men came hurrying along the wall, and arrows began to fall among the assailants, but by this time the work of the axemen was nearly done, and in 5 minutes after the first blow was struck, the massive gates fell splintered, and Jethro rushed in at the head of his band. The garrison, headed by the usurper himself, endeavored to stem their inrush, but, taken by surprise, half armed, and ignorant of the numbers of their assailants, they could not long withstand the determined onslaught of Jethro's men. Jethro himself made his way through the crowd of fighting men, and engaged in a hand-to-hand fight with the usurper, who, furious with rage and despair at the sudden capture of the palace, fought but wildly, and Jethro's heavy axe soon terminated the conflict by hewing clean through helmet and head. The fall of the usurper was for the moment unnoticed in the darkness and confusion, but Jethro shouted to his men to hold their hands and fall back. Then he called upon the garrison to surrender, telling them that Amusis had fallen, and that Amuba, the son of Phrases, had arrived, and was now king of the Rebu.
"We do not war against our own people. The Egyptians are our only enemies. Some of you may know me. I am Jethro, and I call upon you to join us and make common cause against the Egyptians, who are even now being attacked by our young king."
The garrison were but too glad to accept the terms. Fear rather than love had attached them to Amusis, and they were delighted to escape the prospect of death, which had the moment before stared them in the face, and to swear allegiance to their rightful king. As Jethro ceased, therefore, shouts of "Long live Amuba, king of the Rebu!" rose from them.
"Form up in order instantly under your captains," Jethro commanded, "and follow us."
The fray had been so short that it was but 10 minutes from the moment when Jethro's horn had given the signal for attack to that when he led his force, now increased to twice its former dimensions, to the assistance of Amuba. When he reached the wall that separated the Egyptian barracks from the rest of the town, he found that Amuba had entered without resistance, and had captured 2 or 3 buildings nearest to the gate, surprising and slaying their occupants; but beyond that he had made no progress. The Egyptians were veterans in warfare, and after the first moment of surprise had recovered their coolness, and with their flights of arrows so swept the open spaces between the buildings that the Rebu could make no progress. Jethro ordered the troops who had just joined him, all of whom carried bows and arrows, to ascend the walls and open fire upon the buildings occupied by the Egyptians. Then he with his own band joined Amuba.
"All has gone well," he said. "The palace is captured and Amusis slain. I would do nothing further tonight. The Egyptians are 4,000 strong, while we have but half that number. It would be madness to risk a repulse now. I will send off messengers at once to the governors of all the towns and to our friends there, informing them that the usurper is slain, that you are proclaimed king and are now besieging the Egyptians in their quarters, and ordering them to march hither at once with every man capable of bearing arms. In 3 days we shall have 20,000 men here, and the Egyptians, finding their position hopeless, will surrender; whereas if you attack now we may be repulsed and you may be slain. And in that case the country, left without a leader, will fall again into slavery."
Amuba, whose armor had already been pierced by several arrows and who was bleeding freely, was with some difficulty persuaded by Jethro to adopt his counsel. He saw at last that it was clearly the wisest plan to adopt, and orders were at once issued to the men to desist from further assaults, but to content themselves with repelling any attacks the Egyptians might make. These, however, were too ignorant as to the strength of their assailants to think of taking the offensive, and until morning both sides contented themselves with keeping up an incessant fire of arrows against the openings in the buildings occupied by their foes. In the morning Amuba ordered some green branches to be elevated on the flat terrace of the house he occupied. The signal was observed and the fire of the Egyptians ceased. As soon as it did so Jethro presented himself on the terrace, and a minute or two later the Egyptian governor appeared on the terrace of the opposite building. Not a little surprised was he to hear himself addressed in his own language.
"In the name of King Amuba, son of King Phrases and lawful ruler of the Rebu, I, Jethro his general, summon you to surrender. The usurper Amusis is dead, and the whole land has risen against you. Our force is overpowering. Resistance can only result in the death of every Egyptian under your orders. Did we choose we could starve you out, for we know that you have no more than a week's provisions in your magazines. There is no possibility that assistance can reach you. No messenger could pass the watchers in the plain, and could they do so your nearest force is hundreds of miles away, and is of no strength to fight its way hither. In the name of the king I offer to allow you to depart, carrying with you your arms and standards. The king has been in your country. He knows how great and powerful is your nation, and fain would be on terms of friendship with it. Therefore he would inflict no indignity upon you. The tribute which your king laid upon the land is far more than it can pay, but the king will be willing to send every year, to the nearest garrison to his frontiers, a tribute of gold and precious stones of 1/5 the value of that which has been until now wrung from the land. This he will do as a proof of the honor in which he holds your great nation, and as a recognition of its power. The king ordered me to say that he will give you until tomorrow morning to reflect over his offer. If it is refused, the whole garrison will be put to the sword."
So saying, Jethro descended from the terrace, leaving the Egyptians to consider the terms he proposed. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G.A. Henty. Chapter 20. The King of the Rebu. The offer that Amuba had made through Jethro was a politic one, and he was influenced by two motives in granting a delay of 24 hours before receiving the answer. In the first place, he felt sure that his own force would, before the conclusion of that time, be trebled in strength, and that should the Egyptians refuse he would be able to repel any efforts they might make to cut their way out until he would be at the head of such a force that he could at will either storm their positions, or, as he intended, beleaguer them until starvation forced them to surrender. In the second place, he thought that the Egyptian answer, if given at once, would probably be a refusal, but the time for reflection would enable them to look their position in the face and to recognize its hopelessness. On the one side would be certain defeat and death, on the other their general would lead out his command intact and without dishonor. Although he had threatened to put the garrison to the sword in case they refused, Amuba had no intention to carry out his threat, but on the contrary had determined that even were the Egyptians forced to surrender by famine, he would freely grant them the same terms he now offered. He knew the proud and haughty nature of the Egyptians, and that the news of the massacre of a great garrison and the successful rising of a tributary province would excite such deep feeling that sooner or later an army would be dispatched to avenge the disaster. If, however, the garrison left the country with their arms and standards, no disgrace would be inflicted upon the national arms, and as a tribute, however much reduced, would still be paid, they could still regard the Rebu as under their domination. The reduction of the tribute, indeed, would be an almost imperceptible item in the revenue of Egypt. Leaving Jethro in command of the beleaguering force, Amuba, accompanied by Chebron, who had been at his side during the fighting, and a small bodyguard, went back into the town. The news of his coming had already spread, and the inhabitants, who had remained in their houses in terror during the, to them, unaccountable tumult of the night, had now poured out into the streets, the great space in front of the palace being densely packed with people. As Amuba approached, a deafening shout of welcome was raised, the gates of the prisons had been thrown open, and those arrested the previous day, and many others of the principal captains of his father's army, thronged round him and greeted him as their king. With difficulty a way was cleared to the gate of the royal enclosure. Amuba, after entering, mounted the wall and addressed a few words to the people. He told them that in defiance of all probability he had escaped from his captivity in Egypt, and had made his way back to his native land, intent not so much on claiming his rightful position there, as of freeing them from the power of their oppressors. He promised them that he would always respect their rights and usages, and should endeavor to follow in the footsteps of his father. Then he retired to the palace, where he held a council with the captains and leading men in the city. Orders were at once issued for every man capable of bearing arms to provide himself with some kind of weapon, and to assemble at noon in the great square. Lists were drawn up of all the officers of the late army still living in the town, and when the gathering took place at noon, these were appointed to form the men into companies, to appoint sub-officers, to see to the state of the arms, and, as far as possible, to supply deficiencies. A larger proportion than was expected of the 3,000 men that assembled were found to be provided with weapons. Although nominally all arms had been surrendered to the Egyptians, great numbers of spear and arrowheads, swords and axes had been buried. Shafts had been hastily made for the spears, and bows used for the purposes of the chase were now brought out to do service as fighting weapons. Many hundreds of spears and swords had been found in the stores at the palace, and when these were served out most of the men had a weapon of some sort. They were at once marched up to the Egyptian enclosure. Those with bows and arrows were placed upon the walls, the rest were massed near the gate in readiness to advance to the assistance of the band within, should the Egyptians make an attempt to cut their way out. In point of numbers, Amuba's forces were now superior to those of the Egyptians, but he was well aware that the superior arms and discipline of the latter would enable them to make a successful sortie should they determine to do so. The women of the town were ordered to set to work to grind the grain served out from the magazine in the palace, and to bake bread both for the fighting men present and for those expected to arrive. By noon the latter began to flock in, the contingents from the towns arriving in regular order, while the shepherds and villagers straggled in irregularly as the news reached them of the events of the previous night. By evening fully 10,000 men had arrived, and as the Egyptians had remained quiet all day, Amuba had every hope that they had decided to accept the terms he offered, and that there would be no occasion for further fighting. The troops, however, remained under arms all night, ready to repel an attack. And in the morning Amuba and Jethro mounted together onto the terrace of the building from which the parley had taken place on the previous day. A few minutes later the Egyptian governor and a group of his officers appeared on the opposite house.
"This is King Amuba," Jethro said in a loud voice. "He is here to confirm the terms offered yesterday, and to receive your answer." "We are ready," the Egyptian governor said, "to retire beyond your frontier, carrying with us our arms, standards, and valuables, it being understood that we make no surrender whatever, but that we march out on equal terms, holding, as we do, that we could, if we chose, cut our way out in spite of any resistance." "You may hold that belief," Amuba said, and the Egyptian was astonished at finding that the king, as well as his general, was capable of conversing in the Egyptian tongue. "And indeed, knowing and honoring the valor of the Egyptian troops, I admit it is possible that, although with great loss, you might make your way out, but more than that you could not do. You could not hold the country, for you have a nation against you. It is doubtful whether you could reach the frontier. Surely it is better, then, that you should leave with honor and without loss." "As to the tribute that you offer," the Egyptian commander said, "I have no power to agree to any diminution of the terms imposed by the king, and if it be his will that an army invade your country to enforce the former terms, I, with the troops here, must march as ordered, without imputation of having behaved treacherously."
"That is quite understood," Amuba said. "But I trust, my lord, that you, having seen for yourself how poor is our country, how utterly unable to continue to pay the tribute formerly demanded from us, which has already impoverished us to the last degree, will represent the same in your dispatches to the king, and will use your good offices in obtaining his favorable consideration of our case. I can promise you that the tribute shall be paid regularly. I regard Egypt as the greatest power in the world, and I am most desirous to continue in friendly relations with it. And I swear to you that it will be no fault of mine if any complaint reach you of trouble on our part." Amuba's speech was well calculated to soothe the pride of the Egyptian. The latter was perfectly conscious, although he spoke confidently, that it would be no easy matter for his troops to cut their way through the narrow gateway held by the masses of the Rebu, still less to make their way, harassed as he was, to their frontier. If he returned with his troops intact and in good condition, he could so represent circumstances that no blame or discredit would fall upon him, and personally he was exceedingly pleased at the prospect of the termination of his soldiering at a post so far removed from Egypt and civilization. He therefore agreed to the terms Amuba proposed, and after a short parley the conditions of the evacuation of the town by the Egyptians were arranged. Amuba agreed to withdraw his men from the buildings that they occupied, and also from the gate, and to place them all upon the walls, thus saving the Egyptians the humiliation of passing through lines of armed men, and avoiding the risk of a broil arising between the soldiers. He at once issued the necessary orders, and the Rebu retired to the walls, where they could defend themselves in case of any treachery on the part of the Egyptians, and the inhabitants of the city were all ordered back from the road leading from the entrance to the Egyptian enclosure to the gate in the city walls. An hour later the Egyptians drew up in order in their enclosure. Each man carried with him food sufficient for a week's subsistence, and Amuba had arranged that a certain number of bullocks should be sent forward at once to each halting place on the way to the frontier, and that there a herd sufficient for their subsistence during their march to the nearest Egyptian garrison should be awaiting them. In firm and steady order the Egyptians marched out. The images and symbols of the gods were carried aloft, and the bearing of the soldiers was proud and defiant, for they, too, were doubtful whether the Rebu might not intend to make an attack upon them, the terms granted them seeming to be almost too good to be trusted. No sooner had the rear of the column passed out through the city gate than the Rebu with shouts of joy flocked down from the walls, and the city gave itself up to rejoicing. Jethro had at once sent out messengers to see that the oxen were collected at the points agreed upon, and to issue orders that the population along the line of march should all retire before the arrival of the Egyptians, who might otherwise have been tempted to seize them and carry them off as slaves with them in their retreat. For the next few days Amuba's time was wholly occupied in receiving deputations from the various towns and districts, in appointing fresh officials, and in taking measures for the rearming of the people and their enrollment in companies, so that the country should be in a position to offer a desperate resistance should the Egyptians determine to recapture it. It was certain that many months must elapse before any force capable of undertaking their invasion could march from Egypt, but Amuba was determined that no time should be lost in making preparations, and he decided that something of the tactics and discipline of the Egyptians should be introduced into the Rebu army. He had on the very night of the surprise of the town sent on a message to inform the girls of his success, and that neither Chebron nor himself was hurt. Having by unremitting work got through his most pressing business, he left Jethro, who was now formally appointed general in chief, to carry on the work, and started with Chebron to fetch the girls to his capital. But he was now obliged to travel with a certain amount of state, and he was accompanied by 20 of the leading men of the Rebu in chariots, and by an escort of light-armed horsemen. At each town through which he passed he was received with rapturous greetings and hailed as king and deliverer of the nation. 2 days after starting he arrived at the little seaport, and after receiving the usual greeting from the inhabitants and holding an audience at which he received the principal inhabitants who came to tender their allegiance, he made his way to the house of the Persian merchant where he had placed the girls. As his chariot stopped at the door the merchant appeared on the threshold and made a profound prostration. He had until the arrival of Amuba at the town been in entire ignorance that those who had placed the girls under his charge were other than they seemed. He knew indeed from their ignorance of his language that the girls were not Persians, but supposed that they were female slaves who had been brought from a distance with a view, perhaps, of being presented as an offering to the king. After a word or two with him, Amuba and Chebron entered the house and ascended to the apartment which had been set aside for the girls. They were standing timidly at one end of the room, and both bent profoundly as he entered. Amuba for a moment paused in astonishment, and then burst into a fit of laughter. "Is this your sister, Chebron, who thus greets her old friend in such respectful fashion? Am I myself, or someone else?" "You are King Amuba," Mysa said, half smiling, but with tears in her eyes. "That is true enough, Mysa; but I was always prince, you know, so there is nothing very surprising in that." "There is a great difference," Mysa said, "and it is only right where there is such a difference of rank." "The difference of rank need not exist long, Mysa," Amuba said, stepping forward and taking her hand. "Chebron, who is your brother, and like a brother to me, has given me his consent, and it rests only with you whether you will be queen of the Rebu and Amuba's wife. You know that if I had not succeeded in winning a throne, I should have asked you to share my lot as an exile, and I think you would have said yes. Surely you are not going to spoil my triumph now by saying no. If you do, I shall use my royal power in earnest and take you whether you will or not." But Mysa did not say no, and 6 weeks later there was a royal wedding in the capital. Amuba had at once allotted one of the largest houses in the royal enclosure to Chebron, and to this he took Mysa while Amuba was making the tour of his country, receiving the homage of the people, hearing complaints, and seeing that the work of preparation for the defense of the country was being carried on, after which he returned to the capital. The wedding was celebrated in great state, though it was observed that the religious ceremonies were somewhat cut short, and that Amuba abstained from himself offering sacrifice on the altars of the gods. The ceremony was a double one, for at the same time Chebron was united to Ruth. For the next year the preparations for war went on vigorously, and the Rebu army was got into a state of great efficiency. Amuba and Jethro felt confident that it could successfully withstand any invading force from Egypt, but, as they had hoped, Egypt made no effort to regain her distant conquest, but was content to rank the land of the Rebu among the list of her tributary nations and to accept the diminished tribute. Once prepared for war, Amuba turned his attention to the internal affairs of the country. Many of the methods of government of Egypt were introduced. Irrigation was carried out on a large scale, and the people were taught no longer to depend solely upon their flocks and herds. Stone took the place of mud in the buildings of the towns, rigorous justice was enforced throughout the land, wagons and carts similar to those of Egypt took the place of pack animals, which had hitherto been used for transport. Improved methods of agriculture were taught, and contentment and plenty reigned in the land. Chebron remained Amuba's chief minister, advisor, and friend, and under their joint efforts the Rebu rose from the condition of a mere settled tribe to that of a small but flourishing nation. Another change was made, but more slowly. Soon after his accession, Amuba assembled many of the leading men and chief priests in the country, and explained to them the convictions held by himself and Chebron and their wives, that there was but one God who ruled over the world, and that this knowledge was the highest wisdom of the Egyptians. He explained to the priests that he did not wish to overthrow the temples or disturb the worship of the former gods, but that he desired that the people should not remain in ignorance, but should be taught that the gods as they worshipped them were but symbols or images of the one great God. He said he had no thought of enforcing his convictions upon others, but that all would be free to worship as they pleased, and that at all times he and Chebron would be ready to confer with those who wished to inquire into these matters. In this matter alone Amuba met with much opposition in carrying out his plans, and had he been less popular than he was with the people, his efforts might have cost him his throne and his life. But the Rebu were devoted to him, and as the priests came gradually to see that the change would not diminish their power, their opposition died away, especially as many of the younger men were soon convinced by the arguments of the king and his minister, and preached the new religion with enthusiasm among the people. But it was not until many years after that Amuba had the satisfaction of knowing that the one God was worshipped among his people. He was well aware that the success of the work was to no small extent due to the earnestness with which Mysa and Ruth had labored among the wives and daughters of the nobles. "How strangely things turn out," Chebron said one day 10 years after their arrival in the land, when the little party who had traveled so long together were gathered in a room in the palace. "At one time it seemed that that unlucky shot of mine would not only bring ruin on all connected with me, but be a source of unhappiness to me to the end of my life. Now I see that, except for the death of my father, it was the most fortunate event of my life. But for that, I should all my life have gone on believing in the gods of Egypt. But for that, although you, Amuba and Jethro, might some day have made your escape, Mysa and I would assuredly never have left Egypt, never have known anything of the life of happiness and usefulness that we now enjoy. All this I consider I owe to the fortunate shot that killed the Cat of Bubastes." End of chapter 20. End of the Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt, by G. A. Henty.